And I would also remind you that we have a live stream going on, so if we could remain mostly quiet so that people online can hear the panelists and the keynotes. Well, good morning. Welcome to this GLIS session at Building Bridges. I am Tim Raji, the founder of Alpha Mundi Group and the chair of the GLIS. I'll be your master of ceremonies today. But first, I'll cede the floor to Marie-Laure Schaffenberger, who is head of ESG at Pictet and also the vice president of Sustainable Finance Geneva. Marie-Laure.
Good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be with you today for this very important session on gender lens, pushed forward in the context of Building Bridges by the Gender Lens Initiative Switzerland. It's a really important topic because we don't talk about gender nearly enough. And even though it is one of the key components of the famous E, S, and G that we're always hearing about, it's a key component of the S. And the environmental part tends to be the one that captures the most mind share and the most capital. And this needs to change if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. This morning, before I go into a bit this introduction, I wanted to really thank our panelists, thank all of you as well for being here early and for this 4-hour session, and especially Nathalie Fontanet, who is our state councillor here in Geneva, Minister of Finance, who has taken the time and will kick us off with her keynote. The GLIS is a really important initiative. It was spearheaded by Alpha Mundi and SFG and Gender Smart in order to really put forward the question of gender diversity and SDG 5 around women and gender equality. It is an initiative that aims in this true partnership style of building bridges to really create industry standards, to create financial innovation, and to build awareness around important themes. I said gender was a key component in ESG. Unfortunately, it's not often considered the way it should be considered. It is absolutely key that we support financing efforts in this space because if we are to actually unlock the 17 SDGs, gender is a key component of that, and that could actually unlock over 28 trillion in additional economic value. And we often have these big numbers that are bandied around, but what we forget is that we're not just talking about economic value, we're talking about human capital, we're talking about natural capital, we're talking about social capital, because women tend to be stewards of many of these different forms of capital, and they tend to therefore think about these forms of capital. There's a wonderful book by an author called Caroline Criado-Perez, who wrote a book called Invisible Women. It's called Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. And in this book, she talks about the female-shaped absent presence in data, where our world is actually a world that is grounded in the experience and the perspective of men. And this is unintentional, but it is the case. It means that while the female experience is actually half of the world population's experience, it is considered niche. And we talked about it with Mrs. Fontanet this morning. We talked about it building bridges. We overarchingly talked yesterday at the summit about environment, which is a key component, and climate change will overwhelmingly and disproportionately affect women and girls. And yet we did not address this question. But we're addressing it this morning. And it's key because as we address it, we start to build data where we have these gaps. We start to fill these holes. And when we fill these holes, we realize that companies that have more gender diversity in their boards and in their governance are 20 to 30% more performing. They have this performance with less risk, with less corruption, less bribery. And if you take this out to the country level, it's similar, right? So this is absolutely key that we start to fill in these data gaps and that we start to act and have policies around this. So what's really important for me today is that we get started on the action. The WEF recently estimated that COVID has given us 100 years more to close the female gender, the equity gap between women and men. This is insane when I think about these numbers. I have a 19-month-old daughter. I hope that we're going to be able to exponentially reduce this amount of time, and that moments like this will help us achieve that. So I wish you all a fruitful discussion today. We have really interesting keynotes. We have 3 panels that are going to be looking at various elements of the gender issue, from financing all the way through to tangible solutions that we can offer to reduce these gaps. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Nathalie Fontanet to come up here to kick us off. We have the great honor of having her here today. She's the Minister of Finance of the state of Geneva, an amazing background as a woman in politics, extremely engaged on the question of gender in her function and throughout her career. And she's actually notably put down a project for a law, which is in a diversity law, which is the first of its kind in our country. So this also shows this importance of the governance piece at the top. When we have women at the top, they make change happen. As a powerful voice in Geneva and Switzerland, I give you Nathalie Fontanet.
Thank you, Marie-Laure. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very happy and honored to be with you today for this event organized by Gender Lens Initiative for Switzerland as part of the Building Bridges program. I would like firstly to thank all the organizers for their invitation, and in particular congratulate them for having created such a diverse and exciting program for this morning session on gender equality, with some outstanding speakers that I'm looking forward to hear. This goes to the heart of 2 terms that are particularly important to the Geneva State Council. First, sustainable finance. We spoke about it, an area that is both necessary and promising, and for which our canton offers immense potential in numerous ways. And secondly, as we are discussing this morning, gender equality in the world of work. My role at the State Council sits at the point where these 2 topics meet, since I head up the Department of Finance and Human Resources, which is also responsible for the Office of Equality and Violence Prevention. Although women are still significantly underrepresented in finance, as unfortunately in most economic sectors, this is not the case with regard to the public finances in our canton. You will note, for example, that I am only the 7th woman to have been elected to the government in Geneva, but the 3rd to take charge of the canton's finances. This demonstrates, where it needed, that we are not afraid of challenges. I'm also pleased to see that more and more managerial positions are now occupied by women in bastions of the administration that until recently were dominated by men. And it was my pleasure, for example, to appoint a female Director General to the Cantonal Tax Authority, as we have another woman heading up the Federal Finance Administration. This is a trend that we can celebrate. Before I turn to the current state of gender equality in the workplace in Switzerland and Geneva, I would like to emphasize our canton's commitment to sustainable finance. In practice, this commitment is reflected in active support for key players in the sector, but also the issue of green bonds, which our canton pioneered in Switzerland. Following an initial green loan of 620 million in 2017, the fund high energy performance buildings in the health sector, the canton of Geneva successfully secured further funds in late 2019 with an issue of green bonds. This issue attracted numerous investors and raised 660 million francs to cover the investments made by the canton for the construction of the Cornavin, Eau-Vive and Masse Seva rail link. Let us now turn to the issue of gender equality in the world of work, and absolutely essential issue that affects me and more than one respect. First, on a personal level, and I will come back to it in more detail, I know the difficulties women face during their working lives, and I know what it takes to overcome these obstacles. As I mentioned, it is my privilege to be responsible for the Office of Equality and Violence Prevention. Equality in the workplace is one of the areas this department tackles tirelessly, with all the challenges that involves, as we know. Even today, gender inequality persists in the labor market. Women working in the private sector in Switzerland earn almost 20% less than men. The gap in the private and public sector combined is 12%. More worryingly, 44% of this gap is not explained by objective factors and points to potential pay discrimination on the basis of gender. Where do things stand in Geneva? If we look at all employees in the canton, the median salary for women is 5.3% lower than for men. The federal and cantonal statistics all point at the same phenomenon. Although women now have equivalent levels of education to men and are represented in the labor market in large numbers, they continue to be paid less. Even now, women are still in the minority in senior management position and our country's governing bodies. Just 17% of board members and 9% of senior managers are women. This proves that the equity we have enshrined in law has not yet been translated into practice. The law establishes the framework and objectives of equality, but implementing it in practice relies on businesses and the administrative authorities. Yet we know that a balanced representation of men and women on decision-making bodies not only provides a truer reflection on the reality of society, but also optimizes diversity by expressing a wider range of ideas and points of view that produces better results regardless of the area of activity. We know that this is also the case in finance and will be demonstrated throughout the morning. Motherhood is still a significant element in women's careers in Switzerland. Career breaks and part-time working contribute to de-skilling among female staff. The problem is particularly acute among women who have had the best basic education. The division of labor within couple is also a decisive factor. At this level, it is important for spouses to negotiate to ensure an equal partnership. Public policies and employees organizations both have a role to play in introducing measures to help. Switzerland has taken a step in this direction by agreeing to 2 weeks paternity leave. Of course, it is not enough. And of course, while we still have 2 weeks paternity leave, well, there will still be discrimination while hiring women, because an employer will be worried that the woman gets pregnant and has to have a leave for more than 2 weeks. It's today in Switzerland 16 weeks at the minimum. And until we have an equal parental leave, well, we will still have discrimination while hiring, and in particular women. Motherhood, the division, I've lost my way. Today, women's place in the world of work is no longer a matter of debate. Their high level of skills and tax contribution determine their role as breadwinners. Gender equality in the workplace is therefore a fundamental theme for both private sector, businesses, and public bodies, which must manage equality issues as part of their human resource policy. We also have to remind that for finances company, we have noticed that where there is gender equality and where women are present, well, the results are better. and those companies earn more. So if we know that when we speak of sustainable, the earning and the capital is not the most and the major objective, maybe we can still use it when we want to fight for gender equality. This is also the case in the state of Geneva, and in most other professional organizations, women are underrepresented in very senior posts in public administration's body. But I believe the state must set an example. As a public authority, we must create conditions that support the introduction of measures that encourage women's working and fairness. When I took up my post, I wanted to take measures aimed at promoting women to the decision-making positions in areas where they are underrepresented, especially in official committee and public sector boards. In practice, that means that the various decision-making spheres that fall under the remit of the State Council. In practical terms, this has meant making changes to laws and regulation that allow us to achieve gender equality, which means a minimum of 40% of the underrepresented gender. I did file these new laws and regulations, and I have to say that, unfortunately, the Parliament has still not managed to vote them, thinking that it was too complicated because they didn't know how they would have to choose between a man and a female for different positions. Because what we required was for the entities that were submitting candidates, we required them to file for one man and one woman for each position. And like this, we could make sure that the representation of both men and women was equal. Well, apparently, the Parliament thinks that it's too complicated. So this law and these change of reglement have been made in 2019. We're nearly in 2022, and the Parliament still can't make it go through. So the work is long, and it takes time, and the patience is obviously one of the qualities that we have to have in this domain. In terms of education and training for young people, the State Council has also implemented an action plan aimed at promoting a balanced representation of girls and boys in technical and scientific streams. This action plan has been implemented in primary, secondary, and higher education. Today, we really have one worry. We are speaking of artificial intelligence, we are speaking of algorithm, and what we notice is that 80% of the people that are working on AI and on logarithm are men. And what does it mean? It means that the world in which we will live tomorrow will have been built by men and not taking into consideration women's. And this is a real problem. So this is why the Council of State has put further this program and this action plan. We are not sure it will be enough because we are already late and we already have some programs that are made and that contain some sexist bias. And this is really worrying for future. Furthermore, since 2015, Geneva's cantonal administration has had an action plan to promote equality at the state level. The plan is adjusted and uploaded on a regular basis. There are 5 parts to it. The first is promoting a balanced representation of women and men in managerial position and on official committee. The second is promoting a better work-life balance, 2 weeks of paternity leave. The third one is ensuring that the remuneration system is free from gender-based discrimination. The fourth is preventing sexual harassment. In this domain, I have launched an online formation regarding sexual harassment. And this is very important because we have multiple people, and not just for new employees, because we have multiple people that work in our administration since 20, 30, 35, even 40 years. And they are unfortunately not aware that their behavior is not correct. Because they've always been doing that. They've always been looking at a woman coming in the morning and saying, oh, wow, I'd like to have you in my bed today. You look good. And they think that's okay. And this is not okay. And we made this online formation in order for them to realize that their maybe usual behavior that they do not think is offending, well, is offending. And this is a mandatory formation that has to be done, like in banks, where you have to do every month a mandatory formation. Well, this is the case in the state of Geneva, and we hope that it will help to change also some bad habits that some people have here. As I mentioned and the fifth axe is preventing discrimination in the grounds of sexual orientation or gender and identity. And in this sector, as Marie-Laure mentioned, yes, I have provided a new law which is examined by the Parliament yet, and also it seems to be quite difficult. People are always, when you speak with them individually, they're always in favor of change. But when they find themselves in groups and under a political situation, well, then they hesitate a lot. And I think it's very dangerous because in Geneva we are the place of where human rights have been born, where we care to have them maintained. And of course, a law on preventing discrimination and protecting gender and sexual orientation and gender identity is in this context something that should be done. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I know on a personal level how important this is. And as you may know, nothing predestined me to be a state council, given the late start to my career. I got married when I was very young. I was 20. I was barely out of secondary school. I was pregnant. So I very quickly had my first child, who was a daughter. And then I had a second daughter and a third daughter. And at the time, I opted to devote myself to their education. It was my choice. It was what I wanted to do. I had a real need of building my own family and taking care of my children. And this is what I did for 14 years. And this happens in life. I divorced. It was not my choice. It was a situation that occurred to a divorce. And I found myself with no formation, no job, 3 kids. My advantage was that I was still quite young because I had started it quite young. So, and that my kids were not that young anymore. I was 34 and my eldest was nearly 14 and my youngest was 9 or 8. So that was kind of okay. So I decided that I had 3 solutions to take my life properly. The first one was to have a very big depression and nervous breakdown and stay in bed and wait until things change. The second solution was to find immediately a rich husband that could make sure that my life would not change too much. And the third solution was, to start studying and to make sure that I could get a nice formation and be independent and not depend on anyone else anymore in order not to find myself in such a situation. This is what I did. And I started studying law when I was 34, went to university. I gained my degree, and then I qualified as a lawyer, and then I had the opportunity to join the legal department of a big Swiss bank. And there I started seeing what it was to be a woman. I was very lucky because I was a young, old lawyer. Why was I lucky? Young, because I wouldn't be that expensive. Old, because my children were already born. So I was not going to have a maternity leave immediately. Old also because I looked more mature, and of course some more important files could be given to me because I was more mature. I raised children for 14 years. I had the habit to do 20 things at the same time, to run from one point to the other, to be organized. So it was a real advantage, and I got this job. And I was very quickly promoted also because I didn't have to come home very quickly because my children were old enough to be a bit alone. And when they were sick, I didn't have to stay home because they weren't babies. So I was really usable, very usable. And it was a very big advantage for me, of course, and I took advantage of it. And alongside my studies, I got involved in politics. I wanted to move things forward, and also regarding gender equality. When I say that I know what it is to be a woman, and when we speak of the gaps for women, it's also the fact that often as we work less, I'm not talking of my own situation, but women work on partial time, we have less for our retreat. We have less second pillar. Well, I had none. I had none because my husband was independent. So when we divorced, I had none second pillar. So I really know what it is to have these gaps where you don't work for certain years. Okay, I have to hurry. Sorry. Okay, finished with my personal stories. Let's finish my document. But this is to say we really have to be careful. So my own personal journey means that I know that as a woman, we sometimes hold ourselves back in terms of career plans. Women can be terrible lacking in self-confidence. I think this is our essential handicap. We do not trust ourselves. They struggle to be identified as potential candidates for managerial roles because they don't identify themselves as such. And the media also have a part to play in this, since in the main, they continue to present men in the role of experts. Today's society lacks female role models. Without them, women have no one to identify with and no role to aspire to. Yet, as we can see very clearly today, there are going to be numerous brilliant and inspiring women in the field of finance on this panel, and I'm looking forward to hear them. Your careers and our personalities are the best way of combating stereotypes and changing attitudes. In the eyes of the young women who look at you, you embody the hope of a future where anything is possible. As long as you believe in yourself, I offer you my warmest congratulations. I will end one point that means a lot to me. I promise it's nearly finished. The skills argument very often comes up in the debate over gender equality. When a woman is about to be appointed to a managerial position, we see questions asked about her competence. The opposite, however, is very rare. We will surely have finally turned a corner when people ask themselves whether the 83% or so male board members in Switzerland are all genuinely competent. I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very stimulating morning full of positive prospects for the future for both women and sustainable finance. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nathalie Fontanet, State Councillor for Finance and Human Resources of the State of Geneva, for delivering the first opening keynote of our Gender Lens session this morning at Building Bridges. Before I introduce the next keynote, if I could invite the speakers of the first panel to come to our technical booth and make sure that they are mic'd up for the panel at your convenience in the next 10 minutes. I'd also like to thank Sustainable Finance Geneva, which was the first Sustainable Finance Association of Switzerland, launched in 2008. It has hundreds of individual members, dozens of corporate sponsors and institutional partners. This session and frankly the entire week of Building Bridges would not have been possible without the tireless work of their staff, and in particular for this session this morning, Sandrine Salerno, the Executive Director, Emmanuel Casavi, Claudia Gonzalez, and on the Alpha Mundi side, Arlette Espinoza, and Cecilia Serin. And what I love about this also is how humble and discreet they are, because we gave them the opportunity to speak during the session and they all declined. And it should tell you something that I'm a man and I accepted the role of FMC, I'm afraid. All right, so our next speaker is Sana Kapadia. Thank you very much, Sana, for coming from to join us this morning. She is the head of content at Gender Smart. The Gender Lens Initiative for Switzerland was launched really thanks to the inspiration of Gender Smart in the UK and the first session that we did in 2019 here in Geneva. I believe we are the first national initiative for gender lens investing, and none of this would have been possible without the incredible efforts and energy of the founder of Gender Smart, Suzanne Beagle, who could not join us today, of course, because of the COVID-19 constraints with the UK. But she has created an incredible movement that is international in scope, that brings all sorts of different communities together, and it is very much geared towards concrete commitments and action, something that we need, frankly, at all of our events. And I do hope that not only this morning, where we will finish with concrete announcements and commitments, but at most of the Building Bridges sessions throughout the week, we'll be given the chance to hear more specific actions taken by the speakers and by the event partners. I think that the time for conferences that do not end in commitments is over. And we really need to make sure that what we do translates into action. So, without further ado, Sana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Actually take my mask off now. All right, hello everybody, so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction and welcome. So my name is Sana Kapadia. I'm the head of content at Gender Smart. As Tim said, we're a global field building initiative dedicated to unlocking gender smart capital at scale. We're a community of over 3,000 stakeholders in over 50 countries, and we're so excited for the culmination of this event here today, to actually be in person with so many of you, and for anybody watching on the live stream, a warm welcome and hello. So thinking back to how this concept came together and to actually be here today, I think is just truly commendable. What it's taken to really build this multi-pronged platform, from research and advocacy and really talking about standard setting and financial products and innovation. And to be able to do that at a country level is truly fantastic. And we're so grateful to have been part of that journey. And as Tim said, Suzanne, our co-founder, can't be here today, but I know that she's watching and she sends her regards to everybody. So I'm going to dive right in. And Natalie, thank you so much for that amazing opening remarks. There's so much of what you said that really helped the stage in terms of some of the continued pain points for what it takes to be a woman, not only in the finance sector, but at the wider sort of global field of gender equality. And so just to also re-emphasize one of the points you made around the 28 trillion that could be added to the global GDP if there was gender parity, right? So just think about the massive opportunity that's being forsaken. So I'm going to zoom out and talk a little bit about the spectrum of gender lens investing today. So if we look at public markets to start out with, and this is across different types of financial products, ETFs, exchange-traded notes, etc. According to Parallel Finance and Veris Wealth Partners, there's about $11 billion in gender lens investing in public markets. There's also some data that's supposed to be coming out around separately managed accounts at about $2 billion. If we look then at private markets, and a key source of this data is this fantastic collaboration of Wharton Social Impact and Catalyst at Large, and they've been tracking gender lens funds across private equity, venture capital, permanent capital vehicles, all types of structures, right since 2017, when there were about 58 funds. And in the most recent iteration, which is about to come out in 2 weeks, so I can't say the volume, but at last count, it was over 200 funds and about $4.5 billion raised. On the 2X side, and I know that we'll be hearing from Jessica Espinoza, the co-chair of the 2X Challenge, they have also mobilized $11 billion in development finance institutions and other actors, and there's another big commitment for the next year. So there's a lot of capital that's moving in this direction, and it's really at a few levels of a gender lens. So it's at the leadership level. Where are we investing in women-owned, women-led businesses? Where are women on the board? Thinking really through what an inclusive team looks like, what it means to invest in gender inclusion along the entire value chain. Where are women showing up as consumers, as different types of stakeholders, and that full spectrum? How inclusive are supply chains? So these are just some data points to talk a little bit about where gender lens investing is showing up. On the blended finance side, and considering that we're part of the Building Bridges platform, blended finance as a vehicle for change is quite important. That nexus of gender and blended finance is a little bit slower to have been mobilized, but there are some really interesting and exciting initiatives and products and funds that are coming out that are being quite intentional about how deep they can be when it comes to gender. So just again, to take a step back, there's the US SIF Foundation that looks at large asset owners and asset managers, and they actually look at products that have gender as a factor of analysis, and their sizing of the market is $868 billion. So if we add up those first numbers, it's about 20 billion, and then we have this 868 billion. So you might be asking yourself, which is it? And in some ways, it's both. Because if you want the much broader application, it's the 868, where gender is a factor of analysis. But if you want the more targeted, more specific, more intentional, it's the 20. It's growing fast. It's not growing fast enough. And I think we've had this point before that, yes, we're making progress, but we need to continue pushing the bar higher. And here's where we think more emphasis on specificity, more nuance, doing things at country level that really allows you to get deep, be very proximate to the solutions, be proximate to the providers as well. Very, very key. And on this regard, things like the Alpha Mundi project of G-Search is a great example of really trying to understand where is the gender impact happening, because to one of the points earlier made today, there continues to be a need to really deepen the evidence base around this work. So there's lots of promise and lots going on in this area. So what are some of the key themes that maybe we should be thinking about? And I'm sure it's come up in the summit so far, but climate. I think we're all, and it was also mentioned before that women are, of course, disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change, but moreover, they are really part of the solution. I think it was very obvious at COP, and some of you might have been there, but some of the most interesting speeches, some of the biggest activists, some of the most amazing solutions were all women and indigenous communities, underrepresented groups. So really, without centering women at the solution and really understanding that the opportunity that is missed by not applying a gender lens to climate is something that we really need to reconsider. And Gender Smart has been convening its working group to really bring this dual lens, applying a gender lens to climate finance and a climate lens to gender finance for about 2 years. There's a great report that we've produced. And then more recently, there's a fantastic, practical, action-oriented report that's come out, and toolkit, I should say, from our friends at the 2X Collaborative and other partners that really talks about how to do this We've gone past the stage of why it's important, and now it's about how to do this and how to do it further, faster, and smarter. If you think about the Paris Agreement that had 23 trillion in climate smart investments, just imagine if all of that had a gender lens. There's so much work to do, and we need to keep pushing strategically. Natalie also brought up the area of the care economy more broadly and what it takes to have equal pay, good policies at work. And I think in the context of COVID, this is a thematic that has really increased in its importance, because across the world we've seen the care economy be, the invisible work that has enabled every other area of work to really take shape. And so as an investment theme, different types of allocators are really trying to wrap their head around what are the types of solutions, what are the investable models, what kinds of capital can we be deploying to really help ensure that there is a functioning care economy, and not only early childhood, but all the way to like old age palliative care. And there are lots of interesting models coming up. Another key theme that we've been keeping track of is a wider and deeper intersectional lens. So justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. How that might show up in this context is around, who's making investment decisions? Who sits on the team? What does the board look like? Who's getting funded? What types of capital is being utilized? And so there's definitely ways to get deeper in our gender lens orientation and approach. So I know I whizzed through a lot of that data, and where do we go from here? So, as Tim said, there's so much to this movement that has already happened. Gender lens investing has made leaps and bounds in the last 10 or 15 years. Rightly, as he pointed, when Suzanne Beagle, as one of the founders of this movement, was doing this work, we've made such tremendous strides, but we need to continue doing more. And so my encouragement and ask of each of you in this room here and anybody who's watching is, what's your commitment going to be? What are some steps to action that you can take in the next 12 months? You have this incredible forum here in Geneva and in Switzerland that has all the different actors at the table that are needed. What's a piece of research maybe that your organization can do? What's a new financial product that you can think about? If I think, for example, Responsibility, which is a Swiss example of a private sector fund, last year they went from having a climate smart fund that became 2x eligible with the support of FMO and European Investment Bank. What are some of those other examples around a just transition and what it might mean to have good green quality jobs? Our friend here in the front was talking about doubling down on the S in ESG. What does it mean to actually have a gender lens across each of those pillars, right? So I encourage you to think about what your commitment's gonna be, what action you're gonna be able to take, and maybe I will close, because I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I'm just gonna, get there. Yeah, actually, Natalie, maybe just to mention what you said about bias, I think we really have to confront where bias is showing up in this and really do that deeper work. But maybe I'm going to end with actually a quote from Suzanne, our co-founder, and as I said, one of the leaders of this field, that there is no place, no sector, no industry, no product where a gender and equity lens isn't relevant. It's pervasive, it's everywhere, so I encourage you to think about how you can do that in your own work. And thank you again to Tim and the team for the opportunity to share these perspectives. And I look forward to connecting with the rest of you over the course of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sana, for these amazing insights. And I really recommend going online and checking all the work, the great work that GenderSmart does on a regular basis. If I can invite the speakers of the next panel and the moderator to make sure they're mic'd up and then take their seats. The first panel of this session this morning is dedicated to industry standards and impact measurement tools. Obviously, I think it always helps, especially it helps the financial industry know which way to go if there are clear standards and metrics that are established to highlight the path that needs to be followed. And we have a wonderful group of panelists here. The first one is, well, they will be introduced actually by the moderator, so I will not do her job. Kazmira, if you want to join us here, and we'll have the panelists join here on stage. Thank you very much. And maybe just a quick hello to our online audience. Thank you for joining us through this live stream, where we know that many of you wanted to be here and cannot, and so we're happy that you can participate in the conversation in this means. Kazmira?
Good morning, everybody, and I'm delighted to be moderating this next panel, the standards and tools for gender lens investing. And if I can invite the panelists to come up on stage, please. I'm delighted to welcome Aggie Veres, who's the director of the United Nations Development Programme Office in Geneva, which was formed to help countries eliminate poverty and achieve sustainable human development. And that includes, of course, equal rights. We have Aniela Ungurezan, who's on our far right here, co-founder of the EDGE Certified Foundation and co-CEO of EDGE Strategy. EDGE is a global certification standard for gender equality in organizations. We have Jessica Espinoza on our left, Senior Investment Manager at DEG, Board Director at Alpha Mundi Foundation and Chair of the 2X Challenge, which was founded by development finance institutions of the G7 nations, with the aim of mobilizing billions for gender lens investing, and so far I think it's scored $11 billion. We have David Salozzi, Senior Manager at PwC's People and Organization Department, which leads the Inclusion and Diversity Consulting practice, as well as its Global Equal Salary Certificate Initiative. Thank you very much for being here. So we're going to start with the our male representative on the panel. My first question to you is really to give us a lay of the land. Yes, you can stay comfortably seated. No, just back and forth questions, and I really engage some debates, and we'll try and keep it spontaneous. So if you could give us a brief lay of the land of what the standards are out there for gender lens investing, how many are there, and yes.
Sure. I think I'm the only one with this kind of mic. But does everybody hear me well? Yeah? Perfect. Hi, nice to meet everyone. And thank you very much for the introduction. Just jumping right on the question. So basically, the field of standard in the area of gender equality, or in a broader term, diversity and inclusion, is, I would say, relatively new on the international field. We know, however, that in Switzerland, there has been already some work in this regard for more than 10, 15 years ago. And so basically what we see is that as legislation evolve around the world in the area of gender equality, we see more and more tools are also appearing. And some of them actually if you look at certifications, self-assessment tools, and a number of other ways where companies can actually start this journey of checking whether there is equality in the organization. So I would say that maybe there are two types of approaches as well that companies can do. One is that they look at more from a quantitative perspective, meaning that there has to be a numerical justification of whether there is equal pay for equal work. And there are different ways to do that. So the UK actually looks at the overall gender pay gap reporting. In Switzerland, we also have a tool specific which more focuses on equal pay for equal work. So indeed, this is one of the elements that are critical. And the second, which is more and more, I think, becoming also important, is more the qualitative review of what happens within companies and their culture, HR systems and their top management. How do they contribute to making sure that there is an environment that helps both male and female employees to thrive? So I would say maybe very briefly as a kind of introduction remarks, and happy to continue with all of you here in this discussion.
So if I can ask Aniela to jump here, because we were speaking on the phone a few days ago, and I know you're keen to talk about how the standards have evolved over the last 10 years in your career. You've seen massive changes. So if you could give us a brief overview.
Yes, of course. I think that, as it was mentioned before, with the interest from different stakeholders coming closer and closer to the topic of gender lens, we have seen the need of measurement, standardization, and independent third-party verification, which explain what it was mentioned before, this need of looking holistically of where organizations stand and how they progress from where they are. And what we are doing with our EDGE framework is to look at a certain number of indicators that are diversity-related indicators, right? So they are indicators that pertain to representation across the pipeline. We look at a number of indicators that are equity-related indicators, pay equity, effectiveness of policies and practices to ensure equitable career flows. And then we look at a certain number of indicators that are inclusion-related indicators. The employee's own experience. How do they experience their career development opportunities in the organization? So seeing this kind of comprehensive approaches, looking at diversity-related metrics, equity-related metrics, inclusion-related metrics, doing the work, but not only doing the work, but make the change visible and credible to the internal and external stakeholders. And this is the power of independent third-party certifications that complement what legislations are doing in different countries, because legislations are there to signal that for a society, a certain number of aspects are important. The regulator in the country considers that there are a certain number of aspects that are important for the health and well-being of the society. So legislation, which is basically compliance-driven type of mechanisms, go hand in hand and complement very well market-based mechanisms such as holistic certifications.
Before turning to Jessica and Aggie, I just want to jump back to David, because I know this regulatory side of things is somewhere where PwC can talk about. Are the two going at the same pace? Are we seeing regulation leading the way, and are industry standards leading the way?
Very good question. I think that, well, first of all, let's make it clear, legislation is not going fast. So not sure if you have known, but the Convention 100 of the ILO, which is about equal pay for equal work, was initially created in 1951, right? So this has not been yesterday. And basically, based on my experience also of the past 10, 15 years in the professional field, I see that actually in the past few years is where we really saw a boom in legislative development, not just in Europe, outside of Europe as well. And so I would say that certainly legislations are slow, but I think now it's in a phase where it's going to accelerate. Even at the EU level now, there are proposals at the table to see how at the European level this topic could be regulated. We talk about Canada as well having legislation within the EU, a number of countries. In the Middle East, we have seen evolution. In Asia, we have seen evolution. So firstly, this is going to happen at a faster and faster rate until we kind of close the gap globally in the level of legislation in the area. Now, standards, industry standards, I would say somewhat even slower, develop somewhat even slower. And the reason for that, first of all, is that the legislations that could be a driving force behind these are quite diverse. So in the UK, in Switzerland, in Canada, in many places, you have quite different way of assessing aspects of gender equality. And so that's why basically there are either local standards that develop with the local legislations, or in some cases, we see also at tools, this kind of holistic audit approaches that you see. We have a couple of examples that emerge, which are, let's say, generic in a way that it can be applied anywhere in the world, right? So we see that these also are now coming to the market, but I think that this is still the early phases of this area of standardization.
Thank you. So there seem to be different speeds at which things are evolving. But Jessica, when we were talking, you mentioned that we are seeing gender lens investing being taken on by the mainstream, and we are seeing much more traction in the market. So how is it being adopted?
So perhaps worth spending just a moment to, explain these 11 billions that were now mentioned a couple of times and how we got there and how this also created distraction in the market. We, as the development finance institutions, launched the 2X Challenge back in 2018 at the G7 Summit, initially as our joint commitment, back to Tim's point, no conference without a real commitment, to mobilize and invest at least $3 billion with a gender lens until the end of 2020. And at the time, everybody was nervous. These were the early days of gender lens investing, so $3 billion in 3 years seemed massive. We then went on the journey, and there wasn't at the time a standard for gender lens investing, defining what good looks like. So we collaborated with the wider industry to develop the 2X criteria, investment criteria, of what it actually means to invest with a gender lens. And these criteria have quickly become a global industry standard for gender lens investing. They have been harmonized with the GINS IRIS Plus framework for impact management and measurement. I think that was a key driver of the broader adoption, because everybody who was already using the GINS framework for impact management was now also looking at gender and the harmonized metrics. Then we harmonized it with the OECD DAC gender equality marker. So everybody who was used to the OECD DAC marker also could quickly align with the 2X criteria. And then similarly, a lot of financial institutions were already used to the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, the WEPs, so again, aligning there. So we saw that there was, with the 2X criteria, and actually making it very concrete, what does it mean? How can the private sector leverage this opportunity and really kind of embark or get access to this big business and impact case that we've seen from the studies? That really helped us to crowd in other types of investors and mobilize the broader field. And so the 3 billion commitment ultimately translated in almost 7 billion that we invested ourselves. And if we also count co-investments, that takes us to the 11 billion by the end of 2020. So I think the standard setting work has been really powerful. And we've actually had very interesting connections also with EDGE that I'm happy to talk a bit more about later, but to really see how can we look at these internal standards that already existed for organizations and now also apply it to the investment world. And so we basically took EDGE as a starting point, looking at pay equity, internal policies and practices, but then also looked at other more investment-driven indicators, like looking at opportunities really along the value chain of entrepreneurship, so women as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as employees in quality employment in companies that have this commitment, and then also products and services. Because as was mentioned in this book about gender bias, we see so much gender bias in the way products and services are designed, so this is also a key element in the 2X criteria.
Thank you. So we've talked about the investment side of things, the internal world, and now turning to development. So Aggie, if you could tell us a little bit about how gender lens factors into your work, and also what are some of the challenges that you see in your field?
No, thank you very much. And I want to go back a little bit to the discussion that you started with in terms of the regulatory framework and market-based approaches. I think what we see in real life is that we need to go beyond this, because the regulatory framework, of course, pushes us to comply. The market-based approaches put some incentives. But unless there is a cultural change and a transformation in how we look at these issues ourselves as a society, and how we are working with businesses so that they transform internally the way they approach it, we risk that it's just remaining a ticking the box exercise. And from our perspective, I work for UNDP, which is the UN's development program. We are working in developing countries, and a large number of our programs is focusing on women's empowerment, whether it's through businesses, small enterprises, entrepreneurs, or political participation. And I think, beyond the numbers and the economic sense that we can all use as incentives to kind of as a general carrot for this issue, what we see is that what works is that success brings success. So when you have pockets of success of women entrepreneurs, for example, that then are empowered to be more active participants in the political and the social life as well. And there is a multiplier effect of their engagement. That's when we see that sometimes it's actually the regulatory environment that is being pulled by these actions rather than the regulatory environment driving these actions. And one of the key aspects to this that I also want to emphasize is the transparency of the measurements, the data, and what is actually happening in real life. And we have now a number of measurements. I mean, you mentioned what you're doing with EDGE, of course, is very important. But we need to make sure that the data is transparent on what's actually changing with this gender lens in business engagement, in the financing for female-led or highly represented enterprises and so forth. Because unless we are able to see that progress, we don't know where to intervene. So we need to make sure that the measurement frameworks are transparent and it's accessible, and then they are linked to recommendations and actions on the ground. And maybe just one example, although we may come back to this. With UNDP, we have been working with the business sector globally and working with them on something called the Gender Equality Seal. In a way, it's not too different from EDGE, but in a way, it is very different. Because what the Gender Equality Seal does is we have identified basically a complex set of KPIs that essentially translate into a few indicators where we're looking at, not us, but where companies self-assess how they stand on their gender lens applied to their own internal business, how they run their business, how this translates into the outputs they do. And what is different about it, that it's more important to go through the process than actually the results. So by looking at the recruitment processes, by looking at the various kind of gender disaggregated data that the company is applying, this makes companies think what they can change. And then this certification is then done by a third-party audit company, and then it's the governments that basically award the so-called gender equality seal to business companies that can be visible to everybody. So I think it's this process side of things that we can also encourage and enforce in addition to the sticks and carrots that are out there in the markets and the regulatory environment.
Can I pick up on what you said about data and the need for transparency? Because we heard some of the speakers yesterday talking about the number of different metrics that there are out there, some 600 or so for ESG. So what are you seeing in the gender lens investing field? Have we got to a point where we need to standardize standards? And also, are we in danger of falling in the trap of pinkwashing? If someone wants to, I'll leave it up to you to decide who wants to take that.
I think that there is a need for an effort to recognize what is material, right? Because it comes to that. Some years ago, we were still debating whether we can measure gender and intersectional equity. Then we passed that stage, and we are all convinced that we need to measure. Now we are at the stage where we need to understand what is important to be measured. And also to be very pragmatic in that approach, because we can measure everything. But what is necessary and sufficient for organizations so that they can have a very clear set of quantitative and qualitative indicators to tell them where they are and how fast they are progressing. And Agi, you made a very interesting point that I wanted to comment on. We always have this, when we talk about standards, we talk a lot about transparency, which is a very important key point. But accountability for results and accountability for progress, it is also so important. We should almost not speak just about transparency. We should always say transparency and accountability for progress. And why, I will give you an example. I think we all remembered 5 years ago, where the companies in the Silicon Valley published their numbers for the first time, right? Google published the gender composition in their pipeline, and they were very transparent about it, put it out there. First year, everybody applauded them, phenomenal transparency. Second year, the numbers looked exactly the same. Third year, the numbers looked exactly the same. Was there transparency? Yes. Was there throwing the hands in the air and saying, the numbers look good, but the pipeline, but the legislation, but there are not enough women, there is nothing we can do about it, right? So I think that one of the elements in assessing what is material in terms of indicators is important, but also giving a certain rhythm of transformation to saying, well, yes, these are the things that need to be measured, that are necessary and sufficient. And this is a rhythm that we all have to hold ourselves accountable for making those numbers look better and better.
Thank you, Jessica. I see you leaning forward. Would you like to intervene there?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned can totally echo that, and I think we are starting to see, because there's so much momentum in the market. I think it was mentioned earlier, we just launched a 2X Collaborative as a global industry body for gender lens investing, and we see so much interest, and like basically everybody wants to come on board, which is fantastic. I think it's great that everybody's starting the journey, but I think there is now, there are also calls to really be cautious about pinkwashing and be really intentional and meaningful about, to kind of keep that credibility of the 2X criteria. And I think, perhaps quickly to your point about, do we have to standardize standards? I think one reason why we just did an evaluation of the 2X challenge in the first 3 years, one of the reasons why the 2X criteria were picked up by so many, even beyond those that actually participated in the 2X challenge, is because they are so simple and intuitive, and people understand it and can apply it to their business model no matter what they do. At the same time, we were very cautious to, for example, if we look at the criterion leadership, to look at the underlying metrics and make sure that we build on what is already there. So everything that has already been harmonized, specifically on leadership, we took up. We didn't reinvent the wheel. I think that's really important. And now we see it adopted, like we see bonds that come out that are 2X aligned, which is fantastic. We see funds, institutions, but at the same time, we also realize that just kind of this self-assessment or even being qualified under the 2X challenge for many isn't sufficient enough. We get a lot of demand for actual third-party verification or certification that bonds, for example, are indeed 2X aligned. And it's interesting that the very institutions that issue the bonds or that put up a new fund are asking us for this type of certification. So we're in discussions with EDGE to also learn from their experience and see how we can apply a similar kind of certification mechanism to 2X alignment and the investment side of things.
So a question to pick up on what Sana Kapadia was saying is, so you're all doing great work when it comes to creating these standards and certifications, and yet the sums that we're seeing invested in gender lens investing aren't there yet. So what's it going to take to get that money moving in that direction? David, I see you nodding.
It's a very, very good question, and what we see now, from the practical side as well as we at PwC, we are involved in auditing for equal salary certification, which is of course similar to the ones that were discussed before. What we see as a major importance in this field, I fully agree that for these publications, when companies come out, there has to be some form of a third-party review to make it very credible. What we see as a potential challenge in the near future is that you will also need to have qualified people that can deliver high-quality audits in this field. And so, for example, we ourselves, we are also working hard on building a network around the world with this skill set, and what we see is that indeed it doesn't necessarily yet exist on the market where you can just acquire people that are able to do this type of audits. You need to have a mix of ability to audit, like let's say, for example, in the financials field or in the IT security or other fields. So you need to have the skepticism, the investigative mindset, but on the other hand, you need to have the human skills and the social skills so that you can actually understand what happens in this field within companies. So I think that when it comes to having this, the corporate world moving into that direction, really that it's a common theme that you publish your numbers, that you get them audited. For that we on our side as well need to not just develop the standards, but make sure that we have people who fully understand what the standard means and who can work on complying to those standards from the corporate side, but also to work on people who can assess those in a credible way. So I do feel that if the people are not fully qualified, then audits can also become quite meaningless in this field, because there are so many, let's say, subtle and non-numerical aspects that you need to assess, just to make sure that those numbers indeed are correct. So maybe that's my comment on this one.
Aniela, you want to rebound on that?
Maybe I just wanted to add a point of view that we are all aware of, but it deserves to be said out loud. I think that what it will take, it's also to have more gender balance in the high risk-taking investment teams in the financial institutions that are making these decisions. When you look at the asset managers in this world, when you look at pension funds of this world, you know, more gender balance in those teams that are making investment decisions and in high risk-taking professions. We would very much like to see more women in those fields.
Maybe just to add a quick point to this, exactly along the same lines, it's also about, you know, how we are developing the products, the financial products that are targeting especially women. So along the same lines, we have to have more women designing products for women, those who know what the need is, what the demand is, and what's the difference that they are looking for in terms of these financial products and overall investment opportunities. So I think it has to come in a holistic way, from design to implementation, involving women.
Aggie, when we talk about, going back to your experience, access to capital, what are the areas where you would like to see more investment, whether that's in science or, I don't know, you tell me.
I mean, there are a number of ways how we can look at it. I think before we also look at, like, you know, what kind of investments we should support, we also need to think a little bit about pre-investments of how we get women into the business world. And one of the things that we see is there is a huge gap of tertiary education, but not just the formal education, but essentially, you know, the skill set of women entering the job market. There is an enormous gap in STEM, for example, in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where those who are coming out of, let's say, tertiary education in general, not just women, don't have the skills that the private sector is looking for. So the private sector essentially has to invest a lot in re-educating educated people so that they can actually match the job market's requirements. And when we look at women, this gap is even bigger. So we need to invest in women and STEM, women's digital skill sets, women's financial understanding, and so forth, because they are underrepresented in these educational areas. And without those skill sets, you know, we can talk about investing in women entrepreneurs, but if there are no women entrepreneurs in these sectors, how are we going to strengthen these sectors? So I think we really need to take a step back and look at where does it start, and where do we invest so that we see this transformational change that I really think we need to be looking for.
To change tack a little bit, we've spoken a little bit this morning about climate change and women being disproportionately affected by climate change. Could I invite one of you to talk a little bit about what's being done in terms of bringing these two together in gender lens investing? How do the standards reflect that?
Happy to jump in. So as Sana mentioned it earlier, there is this fantastic working group under Gender Smart that has been going on for the last 2 years. And similarly, under 2X, we have a working group that's very active on the nexus between gender and climate finance. And we're for the next year, we're bringing them together. So there's a lot of very interesting, very practical work going on across the investor spectrum. Just earlier this month at COP26, we launched a new toolkit, Gender Smart Climate Finance Toolkit and Guide, that has 12 sector-specific and thematic guidance notes and really helps investors understand how we can make climate finance more gender smart and take advantage of these opportunities at the gender and climate nexus. So that's something, I would encourage all of you to check out, and where I would really love to see more action, because I think gender and climate together can be so much more powerful. And I think there are also interesting connections then to STEM and kind of the future of work and a sustainable future.
So to take things forward a little bit, and in the spirit of building bridges, how can we foster more collaboration, partnerships? How can we improve standards for gender lens investing? Who would like to take that?
I think that in terms of building bridges, I think that it is very important to recognize the fact that when it comes to gender equality, there are a certain number of forces that combine to make that possible. There are the public policies on one end of the spectrum, whether it's reporting, whether it's equal pay legislation, whether it's paternity and maternity leave, whether it's access to finance for female entrepreneurs. So there is the public policy. Then there is the level of cultures in societies, what each one of us, we believe that men and women should be doing at work and at home. And then in between, there is this magic place, which is the workplace, where the two come together. And I think that that is one way of thinking of everything we do, in saying, well, we need to, in some ways, be able to act or impact on each of these three levels. And I think, at least for me personally, there is this belief that, you know, organizations and companies hold the keys of the prosperity of the society. It is just about how we learn to think differently about the value creation and shifting the paradigm and saying how value is actually created matters. And I think that that will help build those bridges and create a cohesiveness between what is going on in the public policies, what is going on in the workplace, and what is going on in societies and at home.
Thank you. And this will actually be the final comment from each of you. So yes, Aggie, how do you think we should go about strengthening collaboration and industry standards?
I think, I mean, in addition to what we already discussed, I think what's important is that we talk to everybody based on facts, based on data, and what makes economic sense, what makes social sense, what makes sense from a social responsibility and development perspective. But I want to emphasize it's very important that it's not perceived, and often it is, as some kind of women's movement. We need to talk to the man. I mean, I'm very happy to see a varied crowd here, but a lot of the times when we talk about gender equality and the GLIS, we're talking to the converted. So I think what we need is we need to talk to the non-converted and make sure that there are the rational arguments and there are the kind of reasoning that matters to them and that makes sense overall as well. And in this sense, what we collectively need to do more of is not just the advocacy part, but the capacity building part. How do we help businesses and companies to build the internal capacities that they can address these issues in a, you know, in a factual and transparent kind of performance-based way, rather than either side of the emotional spectrum. So we need to take the conversation from the theoretical, emotional, to kind of the rational and future-looking, as I keep repeating, transformational way, because for me, that's the key word.
Sorry, yes. I actually wanted to also mention that if there is one bridge to build, it's between women and men, certainly in this area. And actually we see more and more interest and engagement also with what we see in the client corporations, that, you know, as soon as it becomes clear that this is not indeed a women's movement, but it is a business imperative, there is actually a shift in the culture that you can also observe. So I think that what's critical, so that's one bridge is between women and men. Other bridge I think is critical to have top management and employees. There has to be a very good two-way engagement in a company. And then outside the company, I believe that the bridges should be built between the private sector, government, and those actors that act in terms of auditing and assessing to present the truth. I think that these are kind of the groups of bridges we hope to build, and hope you agree with us as well.
The bridge I would like to cross or is from the why to the how. I think that is really what is needed now, because everybody has now understood, I think, the business and impact case and the imperative, but then how to actually do it in practice. And in terms of how we can get there, I think it's breaking down the bridges between different types of investors, so really facilitating this peer learning, not only within peer groups, but also across different types of investors, and then obviously also with other stakeholders, and ultimately with the entrepreneurs or the businesses that we want to help transform as investors. And interestingly, this is something that has been very successful in our 2X collaborative, where we've had this peer learning among investment practitioners, which then helps bridge the gap between women and men, because if you bring in the practitioners, a lot of them are obviously men, and if they buy into it, then you have like this amazing peer learning community where you can have men and women tackling this together and working on actual investment deals.
Well, thank you very much for your comments, and I just welcome everyone to give the panelists a big round of applause. We have time for questions. Wonderful. Okay. Lady. Yes, yes.
What about financial products for non-profits? Most of the social progress is brought still by the non-profits, and we are outside the equity world. We are left with philanthropy, which is less and less accessible. So what financial products for this non-profit world? Thank you.
Yes, who would like to take that question? Yeah.
I'm happy to take it unless somebody. So yeah, this is definitely a big challenge, and I'm not sure I have a full-fledged answer, but what we are seeing, what I think is really interesting is that initially when we started the 2X Collaborative, we said, okay, DFIs, and now the spectrum of commercial private capital providers. But all of a sudden we had a lot of interest from foundations, venture philanthropy, and the donor agencies who are now looking at gender lens investing, very interestingly. So I think there is an opportunity for those players who have been, traditionally just in the grant funding world, which, by the way, I think is also important to maintain. So I don't want to see them all shift to gender lens investing, but because they are now so open to this and want to be part of this movement, I think those could be, where you could have blended finance and develop new products for the nonprofit sector or more kind of social enterprise sector.
So I think that the question is very interesting, and what I could say based on my experience is that probably the non-profit sector society needs to join this fight and join the journey of companies to make themselves truly gender equal. So there are organizations out there that finance, for example, companies, businesses, where they tag along requirements not just of, let's say, to repay the loan, but to basically put in place measures to improve internally gender equality. And there are different organizations that do such setups so that they give loan with the tagline to get additional things implemented in the organization. And so I think that this type of situation where, non-profit sector can play a critical role, let's say if it's joining up with, for example, such an institution or such kind of funding mechanism, and basically this organization will play a role in either educating or engaging employees of that company on the topic of gender equality. So I don't know if this answers your question, but when it comes to accessing funding outside of philanthropy, I think it's somewhat to join the journey and be there for companies that need help.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, lady with a hand up there.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Simpson. Thank you for this great panel. I was really interested in what you all said. 10 years ago, I had the crazy idea to start a startup in the internet sector. I was looking for seed funding, and I went to different forums of investors in California, in Greece, to look for seed funding. So there was a selection process. main question was, how come you're not an engineer and you're doing a business in innovation? And I was entrusted with my profile, and also I was not prepared at all for pitching in front of investors, and I think I was even mocked at some stage. Now I've been a member of an entrepreneurs network, Réseau Entreprendre, and maybe 1 in 4 applications is a woman. So we still have the majority of men starting companies. And I'm wondering, how can you maybe help boost women going into entrepreneurship and prepare them also, and also change the mentality about men investing, because mainly the investors were men, men investing in women. Thank you.
So how can we help to boost women going into entrepreneurship? Aggie, I see your hands up.
A little bit to what I was saying before, that before we talk about investing in women entrepreneurs, we need to make sure there are women entrepreneurs to invest in, or women-led enterprises. So, but this is the challenge, because at the same time when we're talking about investments, obviously investors are looking for profits. So whether it's impact investment or there is a social side of it still. So we need to find a way and bridge that gap of how we as non-profit organizations and others can invest in this pre-phase, basically the upfronting, the investment that will then generate kind of a broader spectrum. So, even just here at the Building Bridges, I was just at a panel at the Accelerate 2030 that are focusing on entrepreneurs. We have a program of the growth stage investment focusing on entrepreneurs, and these programs are the ones that are investing in the capacity building, that are preparing, and a lot of the times with special emphasis on women entrepreneurs, on the business skills, on the presentation skills, on the digital skills, on access to market and so forth. So when it comes to that stage of actually looking for investments, they are prepared. And we need more of that. And I think we need more partnerships for that. So in a way, I wonder if it makes any economic sense for the finance sector to pool some, this is not a lot of funding that's required for that, to pool some funding so that you have more investable and bankable projects coming from women if you work with others who can kind of prepare that sector to be a little bit more robust. But there's a lot focusing on that, but I think it's underfunded, and there needs to be a much more kind of targeted and systematic way of doing it.
I would add to that there's very interesting academic research on gender bias in incubator and accelerator programs. So there are now very interesting ones that have a gender lens and that present themselves as for female founders. But I think we also have to do work with the more mainstream ones, because obviously the others shouldn't be male only, but should be for everybody. And that's where we still see, there's fortunately now this recognition that something needs to happen, and that they have traditionally been gender blind, which has often meant perpetuating gender stereotypes. So that is one aspect. The other is what we have seen in our own work is that there is the gender bias that we know or have always known in terms of capital allocation to startups. From venture capital firms to startups is actually perpetuated by gender bias from institutional investors that invest in venture capital funds that then invest in startups. So something we're currently trying to tackle with a new initiative, 2X Ignite, is to solve the gender bias in capital allocation to female-led venture capital firms, so that because they actually have strategies to overcome gender bias. So back to your point, we really have to tackle the challenge of having women in investment decision-making power, because otherwise we won't overcome gender bias when it comes to financing women entrepreneurs.
Maybe just one quick thing that I think we can all do a better job of. Seeing is believing, right? So making more of a role model type of profiles of female entrepreneurs who succeeded, talking more about them, talking more about how they succeeded, talking about those big exits that they managed to have. I think that this is very important, and we can all do a better job. I don't know if you saw, there is a little bit of this shyness when we think about male entrepreneurs, those big checks, the billion, the 2 billion exit, the unicorn. But when it comes to female entrepreneurs, although there are many female entrepreneurs that have those kind of big exits, we do not talk about ticket sizes, we do not talk about exits. So I think that we could do a better job of talking about those female entrepreneurs who succeed, who are out there across different fields with big exits and with very successful fundraising strategies.
Thank you very much for your questions, and the panelists, I'm sure, will be around to take any other questions later, so we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Kazmira Jefford, Editor-in-Chief of Geneva Solutions, for moderating the panel, and to our panelists for their wonderful insights. I think whenever we've set the industry standards, best practices, and metrics, then these standards have to be implemented in organizations of each industry. And organizational change of that scope, if it has to be pervasive and permanent, really boils down to leadership. And so that's the focus, coincidentally, of our next panel. It's gender leadership in finance. But before that panel, we will take a 10-minute break. So I invite you to come back at 10:10, the same for our online audience, for the next panel. Thank you very much. I will just launch the session in 30 seconds and then you have control for
Yes.
about 40 minutes. We should finish at Good morning. If I can ask you to please find your seats, we will get started with our next panel. Please find your seats. We have an online audience that's also waiting for the panel to get started. And so our next panel is on the gender leadership in finance, and it will be moderated by Marta Ra, who's a co-founder of Women in Sustainable Finance. Marta, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm really thrilled for today's panel. We have 4 amazing women with very interesting careers who will share today their story. And I don't want to take too much of the time. I would just like to introduce them shortly before they share their own success story. So on the very left, we have Elif Aktung, which is managing partner of Pictet. She joined 2011. Since 2021, she co-heads Pictet Alternative Advisors and is chairwoman of the board of Pictet Alternative Advisors. She was managing director with Goldman Sachs in London prior to joining Pictet, having worked both for M&A advisory and proprietary trading. She holds an MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business and a degree in finance from the Institute of Politique de Paris. Next to her, we have Fiona Frick, CEO of Unigestion. She started as a fundamental analyst at Unigestion and was appointed to the CEO in 2011. She has more than 30 years of experience in asset management industry. She serves on several boards, such as the Swiss Sustainable Finance and the Sustainable Finance Geneva, and she's also a member of the EMEA Committee of Standard Boards of Alternative Investments. She holds a master's in business administration from the Institut Supérieur de Gestion in Paris and a degree in literature and philosophy from the University of Dijon. Next to her, we have Monique Villatou. She's CEO of BNP Paribas Switzerland. She has been with the group for over 30 years. She started in retail banking in France and later joined the corporate and institutional banking in France. She has also worked for BNP in the US, Thailand, and in Canada. She has a degree from the ESCP Business School. Next to her, we have Alain Suhard-Steffen. She's managing director of Credit Suisse. She has over 20 years of experience with strategic clients and family offices. She's also a senior relationship manager, and she holds a bachelor's degree from the ITAM and an MBA from INSEAD. So welcome to this panel today. I'm really thrilled to have such excellent and exciting women here sharing their success stories. Please, I would like each one of you to take maybe 5 minutes to share your own personal story, and I will give to you an open question. How did you become the person who you are today? And if you don't mind, Elif, to start first.
Of course. First of all, thank you very much for having us over. It's a real honor to be with you in this room and with all of you watching the event live. I just wanted to, when I was thinking of what I would say, maybe just focus on a few points. We are all very much shaped by the stories of our youth, I'm sure, and my fellow panelists here will I'm sure, also share their personal stories. But for me, it really started early on. I lost my father when I was 11 years old, and for various reasons I won't go into today, I had to really sort of switch into survival mode. And that for me meant very much focusing on studying and really doing everything that I could to live up to the unframed expectations of my father. And that very much also meant that whenever I encounter a problem, once the emotional reaction is past, because there always is one, at least with me, I very quickly switch into decision-making mode and being in the doing, yet while still having this empathy that perhaps comes from my personal story. And I found that to be quite a powerful combination in my personal life, but also in my professional life. The other point I wanted to touch upon was, we're all faced, and men and women alike, in uncomfortable situations in our professional careers. And it's quite important to always stick to your own values and really draw the line between what is acceptable, what is stretching your own capabilities to do things that are uncomfortable perhaps, but still acceptable, versus, what is not acceptable, where, your values do not permit you to go. And perhaps I'll give an example from my previous employer in sort of American bank, investment bank, where at some point, as I was becoming more senior, I was told, Ellie, if you need to, I was based in London, you need to go to New York and meet with all the partners and tell them how great and wonderful you are. And that felt a little bit like a waste of time for me. I was a prop trader and very much lived by the market, so the idea of taking a plane to go to New York, besides sort of the unecological aspects of it, that would be front of our minds today, but some 15, 20 years ago, that wasn't really the point. But I did force myself to do it, and some conversations were uncomfortable. I was wondering why I was there and had to sort of force myself to go into self-marketing mode. But some other conversations were quite enriching, and I later understood that the point was actually that when later on the senior leadership of the bank talked about me, they wouldn't say, yeah, I know Elif, he's a great guy. So at least, that, was quite obvious and had a merit. There were other situations where, I considered what I was given as an advice and decided that that wasn't me. It often involved things like, putting yourself before the team, or being much more promotional in order to take business away from others, and that didn't seem like something that resonated with my own core values. And I said, with all due respect, thank you for the advice, but that's not me, and I will not follow that. Fast forwarding to when I came to Switzerland some 10 years ago, I joined Pictet to run a hedge fund, to start a hedge fund and run a hedge fund, and quite frankly, I had no other career aspirations. And that partly, in addition to being a little bit my true nature, allowed me to always voice up and dissent when I did not quite agree, because it's not like there was anything else that I was looking up for. And quite interestingly, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm in my role today as a managing partner, because I was never really worried about saying something that others did not want to hear, and always looking at how can I disagree in a constructive way, and voice up a dissent where it was due. And finally, perhaps I'll just finish with the right content of giving back versus doing one's job. In my previous role, which was again, managing a fund, there was very little interaction with the rest of the group, and there was a very little aspect of it of giving back. And this is where, when a few years back at Pictet, we set up the Pictet Women's Network. For me, it was really a way to share experiences, try to really gather people, and building on what was said in the previous panel, it's certainly not just about women, because we're preaching to the converted, but very much bringing men into the conversation and seeing how we can move the debate and progress. And that very much gave me a fantastic energy, and is part of also who I am today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elif. Fiona, would you like to go next?
Yeah, the mic. Okay, thank you. So something you said resonate with me. So I had a childhood was a bit complicated. So I come from a family which is very mixed. My father was American, born in China. My mother was half French, half Swiss, born in Senegal. And for a reason that I still don't understand, they met in Geneva. For quite a short time, they made me, and then they divorced. And I don't know if I was the cause of that. And then things started to be quite complicated, and I had to step up quite early in the role of managing the family. So my father divorced, he left, he went to live in Russia, always very strange places. And I had to become a sort of family head before being a kid, and then therefore I started having responsibilities and having to say no when to things much earlier than what would have been normally the case for a child. So that's what, when I went to work, I was not so impressed about entering a new environment, because at the end, you know, managing things, saying yes, saying no, was not something very different from what I had done in the past. I would say that the big change that there is today compared to when I started is that there were no role model women at that time. And what I understood is that if I wanted to be successful in this world, I had to be like a man and even harder. So I would say at the beginning of my career, I was much more role modeling myself on other men. And so I wouldn't say that I was very feminine in my management style. This came later at a certain several stages. I was also managing money, which is much more easy than managing people, I must say. And I became CEO in 2011, and I think that's when I started to develop a more gender-biased style of management, understanding more, having more compassion and things like that, and being less on a survival mode, being more capable of understanding and feeling sometimes the stress of others. So I would say that today I'm really proud to have developed this kind of more compassionate management and more feminine management. And what I found great for the ladies that come today is that there are some role model and there are some image to look for. What has helped me in terms of my career? I always loved numbers, so I always wanted to be judged not on the fact that I'm Fiona and whatever, but on results. So I was very clear that I wanted to fix objective on what I will be measured on, and then either I fail or either I do it, but there was no bias in the decision. And that was very useful for me, because then the discussion became very pragmatic about was it a good year, was it a bad year? And then it helped me also say, okay, this is a good year, I've done what I want, now I want more. So I was never shy to ask for more. And I think that is quite important, because what I realize even now that I'm a CEO, that there are some unconscious bias, and that sometimes are not necessarily seen, not necessarily heard, but that's why it's quite important to fix objective, to fix numbers, to be judged about, because that's a way to take out the behavioral bias. And I will stop there.
Okay. You want to go next?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. A different story, I guess. So for me, there is no maybe such an earth-shattering story at some point in my childhood, but I think what made me where I am today, there are two things. First, my story is probably one of being uprooted socially, uprooted geographically. First for studies, and in terms of social background as well. I come from I was born and raised on a farm. So a very different social background to go into finance, and which was not at all on the radar. The dream of my father was to have me as a civil servant, to have security. So that was totally different. But what was important though in the family was the fact that education. Everybody believed in education. And education, you achieve something via education, even if it's to become, a teacher or a civil servant. So I crossed some lines relatively early when, I wanted to study for a business school. Well, you'll never make it there. So that was one first thing that was where I had probably to stand up and go for it. So that was probably a first big uprooting, which was not so easy to live on a day-to-day basis. And then, you know, when I started my career, early on, there were some opportunities to be uprooted geographically. Okay, go to New York. So you would say, everybody wants to go to New York, so when you're in finance, you know that it's the place to be. But still, I jumped immediately, which was not that easy once I was there. At some other point in my career, I also had an opportunity where I made a jump that I had told myself I would never make. I went to live in Asia. I didn't want to, again, for a career move, a move that I had thought I would never do, because I thought, which is partly true, that when you live in a country where you don't speak the language and which is so culturally different, it's very difficult to blend, and you can stay at the fringe and not really have a true, you know, fulfilling life. Well, there are some, I discovered, of course, I never regretted that decision, and I discovered that there are also some very good sides to going to live in another and very different society. So there again, that was uprooted. So that those moves throughout my my childhood and then my career have been key in bringing me where I am now. And also, I have to say that the second thing probably is the fact that I have been, working for an institution which probably, BNP Paribas, at least 15 years ago, started to really pay attention to women and making sure that they were actively making them emerge. And I was there at the right time. I was, some opportunities came to me because I deserved them probably, but nevertheless they came to me, not only to men. And I seized them, and that shaped and helped me as well. So you always, I think you would agree, you also need to be lucky in a career, and I had some luck in that respect. So that's, that combination of my will, probably, to not think too hard about things and agonize about it, but go for it. And the fact that I was also given good opportunities that allowed me to progress, to show step by step that I was able to, succeed and be, a successful leader, and that took me one step further. So that's how I would define my parcours, if you will.
Thank you very much, Monique, for sharing this. Next one is Alain.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, my name is Arlène Schuchard. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, because by telling about my story, you learn a bit more why I became the person I am. Maybe many of the things that at the point in time in my career I saw them as failures, at the end of the day, they taught me so many things that made me the person I'm now. I was born and raised in Mexico, in Latin America, at the time where going to study and making career was not as today. Thanks for God, the things have changed very much. It was very much a career for the boys to go and study, make a career, and for women more to stay home and with whom you were married, which was, terrible. I was always like, in Spanish we say, ratón de biblioteca. I love to study. I was more in the books. So I wanted to differentiate. I studied in a German and a Swiss school in Mexico. So when I wanted to do the MBA, because I started in investment banking, where at that time, if you didn't have an MBA, you couldn't even pick up the phone to say hello to a client. So I wanted to do an MBA. I thought, okay, in Mexico, the role model was like the Ivy League. So I started to make the typical GMAT and everything to get there. And I saw that in my class, 5 of the people who were at my class were going to Harvard. I say, how am I going to differentiate? I have the languages that I will never use them. And I thought about INSEAD. I was a smaller, so I said, why should I go and do the same as everybody else? So I went to INSEAD, and like life is not always easy. When I graduated, it was the entire .com bubble, September 11. So instead of having on average 7 job offers,
If you had more than one, you were lucky. I started my career in the investment banking at the time where you knew when we arrived at the office, but you never knew at what time you were leaving. I finished was very young, and then I couldn't find a job anymore in the IB, and they offered me to do private banking. At that time, I said, what? Private banking? I've never heard of it. For me, it was like very much numbers. I wanted to prove myself. I was in project finance. I started in a large institution in Switzerland. Like I said, like not always easy, but at the time I thought I'm not going to let myself be bitter and bad experiences. They shape you and they make you at the end better. When I started from zero. I had already built, at that time I felt I was like super high up in my career because I was very fastly promoted in the IB. When I started here in the private banking, I started as a non-officer. So my first day at the office, the first thing they told me, oh, you are the assistant of whom? And I was, no, I'm not the assistant of anyone. I'm here. I'm also a relationship manager. It was also very interesting to see the cultural things, the changes, the differences. In Latin America, you're much more American, very much outspoken. I used to raise the hand. At the time I started in Switzerland, in Zurich, the meetings were held not in German, in Swiss German. So it was not so easy. So I was there, to be very honest, I didn't like it. I was looking into going into a different path. I was looking into private equity, hedge funds. But as a woman, I got married and suddenly I was pregnant. So I said, okay, I leave it for a time. Like life, I mentioned, was not always easy. I lost babies, which was a very strong thing personally and also in my career. Because one day I didn't have the babies, for which I thought, okay, I'm Latin, I raise my kids, and then I see about my career. And I also didn't have much of my job, because at that time, if you were pregnant, it was as if you didn't have a brain. So I said, I have two options. I become bitter and what happened, or I go on. I was very fortunate because, as you mentioned it, sometimes in life you also have to be lucky. I had a wonderful opportunity to go to work in New York. Also a major learning because I came like Latin, nice, and that was tough and rough. But I was thinking that in Switzerland was like very back. Here was a completely different environment. I had also to adjust, in my opinion, because I was Latin, I was like completely to the other side, which I was also finding a bit to the extreme. In a Latin country, you go first, they help you with a chair. There in the US was like super. So to make the story short, I worked like crazy. It was a hard time. But I built something and I started to see like my career was going up. And then, because of personal reasons, my husband, they changed him to San Francisco. So we have to change to the West Coast. At that time, there were not so many opportunities. The market I was covering was not covered in the West Coast. My boss at the time, I was very fortunate to have somebody say, hey, continue your career out of San Francisco, but don't quit. So we moved to San Francisco. I think I'm telling this because it also changed me mentally. In the US, I became also a bit the person I think like women we should not be. I tried to be tough and rough, and I was not a nice person. So in San Francisco, I started to see life also differently, see that there were kids, there were life. And that was, I think, for me, always that challenge to do this life-work balance. So I said, hey, why not? Maybe I want to have kids again. Like life, I couldn't get pregnant. So we moved back to New York, and suddenly I get pregnant. I was at the peak of my career. I was going to get promoted, but I have these kids that for me was a miracle because I had lost the other kids. Then comes the financial crisis, Madoff, Lehman Brothers. So I was like staying or quitting. Maybe. One of my learning is in life you should not never, I was a little bit of the mentality black or white. Maybe what I learned about that is to find the middle, because at that time when I had my kids, I decided to quit. And I quit, I went home thinking, okay,
I will raise my kids. Now I finished my chapter. I was not promoted. My kids were born in January. Promotions were in April. So I quit. I went home and I thought, now I'm going to be happy. So it's a little bit also, you always think in your mind things are much better than they really are. I moved with twins to Switzerland in a small town. So I tell you, I instead of being the happiest person in the world, I was the most depressed person. I was missing the office. I was missing very much what I have done. So after 3 years, I mean, at the beginning, to be honest, I was super busy with twins. But when I had the time, I went back. And it was also an interesting thing because I went back working 2 days a week with the mentality of New York in Switzerland. So at home, I was the working woman. And in the office, I was the housewife raising the kids. So I built again from zero because I went back to the same bank and I couldn't say, hey, hello, give me back what I have done. I'm back after 3 years. So I had to gain again the respect of everybody. 3 years, I made like a super career, but I was working 2 days a week. So, as I mentioned, so I couldn't get the promotion because I didn't have enough visibility. So my Latin blood came and I resigned, which was also, again, me, maybe the white and black. And I became independent, thinking the grass is greener on the other side. Now I'm going to be able to be on the side of the client. And, I mean, to my surprise, it was really not what I thought it was. I mean, at least I tried it and I learned a lot. And then I had the wonderful opportunity to go back to a large institution where for me has been, in my career, I think I have been successful thanks to a teamwork, what I can do, how to leverage on different skills on different people. So I started in the bank 6 years ago and, well, here I am.
Thank you very much, Hélène, and also to all the ladies who shared their personal side. I would like to dig down a little bit more on how it is for you to be a woman in the financial industry, if you allow me, because this is a gender leadership in finance panel, and this discussion should not be about victimizing women, but still yet there are very little women in top positions, in management positions, in boards. We will speak about this also later, about quota. How was it for you being a woman back then, and how has it changed for today? And what is your opinion about it? What can we do differently?
Can I just jump in, because I wanted to react to something that Fiona said about role models and,
Sure.
and share a story. Because I really had 2 parts in my career. The first one, when I started in investment banking and M&A with the crazy hours that Arlene mentioned, it was very much about sort of, how do you say, just getting lost in the background. So wearing black or gray suits and laughing to the jokes of the 20-something-year-old, they happen to be French colleagues. So not the jokes that I really did find funny, but I learned to appreciate them and react to them. But it was very much sort of blending in as a mentality. And it was only later on, after the MBA, when I came back a little bit later in my career. And one eye-opening event was during 9/11, we were in the building, in Goldman's building, which is next to the Twin Towers, and we had to evacuate. At the time, we didn't really know what was really going on, just that we had to evacuate the building. And there was this partner who was heading sales trading in New York, Jana Hale, I remember very vividly, and she was the one who climbed on the desk and started directing orders to everybody. She was wearing a red suit, a jacket, and a skirt, and what I remember as a Riviera of diamonds. I don't know where it was, but there you had the image of this person, of a leader who didn't look like a leader, given how she was dressed, and she was a woman, and sort of shouting orders at everybody and evacuating us. And that really, for me, was the change of the symbol of leadership. I really. It opened my eyes, and I thought, okay, I don't actually have to look like a man in a gray suit, but there is this other alternative. I mean, it's a little bit cliche, but it's a true story. And I think, we mentioned the advantages of having a different leadership style. As women, I think it comes more naturally to us, so we really have to exploit that and leverage it. And luckily, I think today's generations really do understand that. But I think when we all started, it was a little bit different.
Sharing your personal remark. Fiona, maybe you can share a little bit. You spoke about your female side or the female energy that you explored when you became a CEO. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit, highlighting the past and the present and what has changed and what we can do today as women in order to stay true to our feminine side but still be equally respected and treated in such senior positions?
So I would say that, first of all, I never saw of being a woman as a bad thing. In contrary, and luckily enough, I had not had to go to kind of any kind of Me Too kind of thing, whatever. So I was lucky, and my mentor was my chairman and my CEO. So I was in an environment which was helping women flourish, and not at all with the glass stealing or whatsoever. But it's true to say that at the beginning, the role model was not necessarily a feminine role model. Being sensitive or being sweet was not necessarily seen as a quality. And so I morphed into the group, and I became tough and very objective driven, and with some of these characteristics. So I morphed in the group which was supposed to be the successful group. Then it's true to say that I did a course at EMD just before I was going to become CEO, and the rule of leadership they taught me was absolutely different than what I was doing, because I was managing men generally, which were managing portfolios. So the thing is, you had to show that you have a position, and if you don't do this, and that's bad news for them, etc. But then it showed the leadership, which is much more compassionate, and I thought, okay, that's different, and it opened a new area, and I started developing that, and I started wearing more colors going to work, less black, less blue, and I thought it was a symbol, in fact, and I accepted my femininity and my feminine way of managing people much more later, when I had already made a bit of my career, and now I'm happy to have both. And I wouldn't say that there is, because at the end there are traits rather than gender bias. There are traits, and I'm happy to play with all the color of the rainbow, and not just with the black and the brown, or not just with the pink, but to use the different colors at different moments. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that you don't have tough decisions to take, but the way you communicate these decisions to people can be much more human. That's what I discovered with time, and it's a never-ending learning story.
Absolutely. What is your opinion, Monique?
So I will touch on what you said, because but first, for me, being a woman in a mostly male environment, I think I didn't think too much about it. You know, it's reality. You deal with it, and I was more focused on the job, my goals, what I wanted to achieve. So you know, there were like you. I was lucky enough not to experience any. Me Too kind of situation. You know, because and we should not disregard the fact that they do happen, exist, yeah. But I was faced with uncomfortable situations, well, especially in France, which situations were pretty, before going to the US the first time, I didn't really pay attention to them, because I guess it was my normal environment. When I came back from the US, I was shocked. I couldn't take those guys anymore, but I readjusted. You find. So anyway, but I never thought too much, like you, I guess, about oh, I'm a woman. What does it mean? How can I? No, you have a job. You have goals. You want to succeed, and you do it. Then about the management style, I had to toughen up. So I did over the years. But I think that that balance that you're able to achieve, it's very difficult to have it from day one, I think. And you know, like you said, Fiona, it's something that you probably acquire with experience. Because when you know, early on you're confronted with a group of male, very alpha, and you're in a, you know, supposedly in a power situation vis-à-vis them, it's very difficult to not fight with their tools. But you know, over the years, you learn different skills, you enrich your palette, votre palette. This is not your scope in English, and then you're able to adjust and to use different skills, the different sides of you, according to the situations, I think. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Monique. Alain.
I think, and adding, do you hear?
Yeah.
Adding to what you have already said, I think it's very important also to keep and to be yourself. I mean, it's very hard to try to be like somebody else. I mean, you will be always a copy of someone else. I mean, it's good to have role models to learn from the best, but at the end you need to be yourself. I think we're living in a diverse world. There are men and women. I mean, I'm thankful that I'm in a job that my numbers can be measured. I mean, it's not that if I'm good or bad, it can be in black and white. It's not like that it's not like, okay, it's subjective if I have been promoted or not. It's in the numbers. But I think going back to that, I have been able to be successful because maybe I'm seeing the things from a different angle, from a different perspective. I'm very much into the clients. Clients are families, clients are men, are women, are daughters, are sons. I'm coming from an environment where they used to do, the very wealthy, this programs father and son. Thanks God this has changed. And now it's father and kids. Why father is the father and sons? So I think we're living in a time where things are changing for the good. I think we should not promote I am very much into meritocracy. You should hire the best for the job. I'm sometimes get a bit angry, to be very honest, because now that I killed myself, I did everything I do, and they say, of course she's a woman. No, it was because of real merits. And I think we are living in a world where we need to really appreciate meritocracy, not despite of you being a man or a woman. And I think if you add this different touch, sometimes it's very good and it helps for business and you can measure it because we see the things from a different angle, from a different perspective.
Thank you very much, Hélène. I would like to dedicate the last question of this panel by looking on numbers. We have also spoke about numbers and facts. Let's have a look at quotas. So the ESG ecosystem considers 30% representation to be critical milestones on the road to reaching gender parity on corporate boards of directors. Just a few facts. Women hold only 16.9% of board seats worldwide. Women hold only 5.3% of board chair positions worldwide. And only 4.4% of CEO roles are chaired by women globally, depending on the source, which one you look at. We have spoken about women, but now I would like also to talk about men. What is the role of men in order to change this number?
Maybe I'll start. Since they occupy mostly positions of power, their role is obviously critical, and I think we are all here today also because we had men supporting us in our careers and powerful men giving us important opportunities. And we were lucky. What our job is today is to make sure that it's not just down to luck, but that we're able to change the way our organizations, our societies think and make decisions. And I think our role is important in terms of being used as a tool of translation in most times, because when you're interviewing a woman, for example, for a senior role, if there are only men in the panel or amongst the interviewers, they don't necessarily hear what is being said. And there's this typical example of, between a male candidate and a woman candidate, both, equally able, let's say, but the men will say, yeah, 200% I can do the job and no problem, and let's just talk about my salary, which is a conversation that men feel comfortable in engaging. It's just about numbers and blah, blah. Same, profile and aptitudes and capabilities, and the woman will tend to say, oh, I really want to make sure I can over-deliver, so let's say that I can do 90% of it, and let's talk about what I need to get the 10% done. And quite frankly, the 100% is probably 300%. And what the men typically hear in that conversation is, oh gosh, so she needs this and this and this, and the other conversation was so much more simple. So probably that woman is not up to the job. And I think if you have, and I found myself in these kind of situations, if you have women around the table, you can say, hold on a second, it's not what she's saying, she's just making sure that she can deliver 200%, whereas, the other male candidate who is probably also very good, but don't think that he's going to deliver 200%. He can probably do the job, but not by as much as you would think, just sitting there and listening. So I think our role is quite important, and the 30% as a tipping point is absolutely key. So this is only the beginning of the journey, and we should work on changing our cultures, our corporate cultures, our societal cultures, so that it's not just down to luck. And being the mother of 3 daughters, it's really important to me.
Thank you, Elif. Fiona, your last remarks.
Okay, so I'm also a firm believer in meritocracy. I don't like quota. I sometimes get weird calls from people asking me to come to boards on companies that I don't even know what they do. And when I ask them why do they think about me, it's just because I'm a woman. I found it quite insulting. So, but it's true to say that I've seen as CEO, we measure what is our gender diversity by position, etc., etc. And I've been frustrating to see that in the last 3 years, we've been stuck at 30%. And I started to dig a bit down to understand why. And what I realized is that there was some bias and that you have to deal, and it goes back to the panel that was before about not only having a number but also a roadmap. And there was some bias that perhaps could be dealt before hiring. So typically what we've put in place is things that, although we want to go for meritocracy, when we promote a job, we want to have a pipeline of candidates which is gender diversified. So you want to have at least 1 woman candidate in the 3 that will be in the final, and that's quite important. As Elif said also, the idea that not only man judging, because as you say, men generally oversell and women undersell, and you have to have people that understand this kind of behavior. But also we've tried to do now is that when we do a job, we try to define what are the expertise we are looking for. And there again, to try to quantify the process. So I think that's quite important, to make sure that the process that brings to a hire permits women to voice their personality and not to be blamed for that. A last thing I would say is, I think finance is evolving. When I was raised and I wanted to work in finance, the role model was Wall Street as a movie, and and now my son looks at Big Shorts. Obviously, it's less fancy, but I think we have a chance with sustainability becoming forefront to show that finance has a purpose, and which is to allocate money or to engage with company toward a more purposeful society. And I think this will make women more willing to enter our domain of expertise, because before, frankly, the role model of being Wall Street was not really exciting for a woman. So I think as finance will evolve, and I think one of the things we should all do collectively is show the purpose of finance, and that we can contribute to a better future for the planet, and we are not the only answers, but we are part of the solution. And by that, we will influence more women, because for the moment, it is not a sector that attracts a lot of women. because of the old archetypes.
Thank you.
I think I agree, of course, with what you said, and also, coming back to the discussion on the prior panel, two things, things have changed, and talking about role models that we didn't have when we started, or far less so in terms of women leadership. Now there are some, so hopefully this will help. But beyond that, of course, that's not enough, but that's part of it. Like, okay, if you go in finance, it's not to be one of those typical Wall Street movie image, but then the measurement, measure everything and have goals and goals where you progress. It takes, like was said in the prior panel, all levels. I heard that you don't believe in quotas. I think quotas, therefore, nevertheless, participate in the dial which is moving, because honestly, otherwise there is such a big inertia in the system that it's very difficult to make things change. So I'm not saying that we should rule with quotas, but I think they are part of the landscape. And then it takes really active policies in large corporations with targets, and targets which are moving targets. For instance, in the BNP Paribas group, we have 30% right now of, all the senior executive exco at the top of the company, and G100 top managers. 30% of them are women. The next target for 2025, which is not that far, is 40. So it's you drive by the KPIs and the measurements, because that's how you push then down in an organization, voluntary policies that ensure that when you hire, you have a pool of diverse candidates, that you actually, you have interviewing pools also where you have a diverse representation of the people who are going to decide, all this, and it takes really a lot of actions, and if we want to have more women going forward at the top position, and in all the, let's say, difficult fields for women right now, there is education, this was discussed before, but there is also the grooming and the identification that needs to be done from ground up in large corporations and small corporations as well, of course. And that takes time. It cannot happen overnight, because otherwise we would be left with quotas and decided, okay, we want X% of women, which would be the worst thing that could happen to women. You need competent women, of course. So that's my take on it.
Thank you very much, Monique. In terms of time, we are already running 5 minutes over. So, Alain, your final remarks, please.
I think everything has been said. I would be very, very brief. I think what we need to share best practices, as what we're doing right now. I think behind every success story, there are also failures from which you also can learn. And not always the path is as green as we think. There are ups and downs, like in every life and in every history. I think that nowadays I am very optimistic. I think there are many things changing for the good. I'm a true believer. I'm as a mother of twins, I would like to leave this a better world for my kids. I may be in my midlife crisis, so I'm questioning myself, what am I doing to do and to live this as a better world? And what it's very exciting, all the things that are happening right now in our industry. I mean, it's just connecting the dots. What its impact, sustainable investing. I mean, it's amazing to see. We started an entire, I do clients, so I was in a networking event for women of impact. It's impact investing. We had the pleasure of having Marisa Drew, talking about what she's doing. I mean, the way by sharing those stories, how people started to get engaged, and it's just connecting the dots. An entire very important topic that we're seeing in finance, what the wealth is being, the next generation, how's the next generation ticking, how they are thinking. I mean, I was shocked. One of my assistants told me,
I think I don't want to be like you, like coming the first into the office and leaving the first. No, for me, it's better a job where I can forget. I mean, the generations, millennials are changing, so how to adapt and also adapt to the world in a meaningful way. And I think that everything that is happening right now with sustainable impact investing is just connecting the dots, sharing histories, I think.
Thank you very much, Alain. I would like to thank all 4 role models for coming here today and sharing their own personal story. I look very positively to the future, that the change can happen definitely together with men supporting us. And I would like to close here as we already over time. I'm sure the ladies will be open to answer any questions in the coffee break. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. In the interest of time, we will jump right into the next panel. Once you've set the industry standards, once you have leadership in financial institutions, the next stage is financial to make sure that you have in your investment policies and in your investment product offering your gender lens approach reflected and integrated. So if I can invite the speakers of the next panel to join us on stage on investing with the gender lens. And I will leave you in the very capable hands of David Uzoki, Senior Advisor at the IISD. David is also a member of the Investment Solutions Committee of GLIS, and we thank him for his pro bono engagement with this initiative. David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, just for the sake of time, I'm going to get started. So thank you very much for staying for the third panel. I know it's been a long moment, but I can guarantee you that it's going to be worth your time. My name is David Uzoki. I am the Sustainable Finance Lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where I focus on mainstreaming gender considerations across different financial instruments, among other things. Before joining IISD, I was working in private wealth management at Morgan Stanley and in investment banking at Credit Suisse before that. So our panel will focus on investment solutions and products that apply gender lens as the benefits of gender diversity is becoming more and more common and well understood among investors. What we are seeing at IISD, that there is an increasing demand for gender lens products and investment solutions. According to a research I saw actually from 2019, there were more than 200 different gender labeled investment solutions, which was already a 50% increase compared to 2018. So I'm sure that in 2021, we have, this number is much, much higher. According to Gender Smart, I saw that the assets under management that follow, that are in gender lens investment solutions is about $17 billion US, which is, I think it's quite a nice amount of money, considering that gender lens investing is still an emerging sustainability theme. But still, when we look at the overall sustainable investment universe, it's still a small part, because that is worth about like $40 trillion US under management. So the purpose of our panel is to hear from providers of gender-aligned investment solutions about their journey and about the experience of providing these investment solutions. And on the other hand, to hear also from the investor side who are investing in these products or other gender products about their experience. So let me introduce the panel from the left to the right. So first we have Michael Briel, who is a portfolio manager at KfW, which is a German development bank. For the purposes of this session, he's representing the investors side, but as also Christina Juhas, who was like a chief investment officer at Women's World Banking, could not make it today. due to COVID. Michael will also cover just provide some information about the Women's World Banking Fund that KfW is investing in. Then we have Raymond Müller, who is the head of UBS ETF and index sales for Switzerland and Liechtenstein. He will be talking about their gender ETF. So he's running the head of a provider of an investment solution or of an instrument. Then we have Andrea Heinzer, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Ovian, who is an asset manager focusing on impact investments in developing and emerging countries. Ovian is actually applying a gender lens of how they allocate capital, so we'll hear from Andrea on this later on. We also have, last but certainly not least, Marlene Hormez, who is the managing director at Alpha Mundi Group, and she's based in Nairobi, Kenya, and she will be talking about Alpha Mundi's approach of integrating gender lens of how they're investing for their funds. And I just want to say that we will have, so each panelist will have about like 5-6 minutes to speak, and at the end we will have time for questions. So please think about any questions you might have, and you will have the opportunity to ask our panelists. But without further ado, I would just like to start with Michael. So Michael, can you please speak about, first of all, about the Women's World Banking Fund a little bit, and then maybe speak about why KfW is interested in investing in this fund. Thank you.
Yes, sure, happy to do so. So after the success stories which we have heard earlier on the panel from women in leadership, I would like to shed some light on women in emerging and developing countries and the struggle they are having to get access to financing, at all or at acceptable rates. And that's why I'm happy to talk about our investment here as KfW Development Bank in Women's World Banking, which is a private equity fund. Unfortunately, as David said, Christina cannot be here today, but I'm happy to give some insights about our investment which we are making there. So Women's World Banking is a fund. It's the second fund. The first fund is now in its exit phase, and the second fund has just been launched last year. The fund invests in financial inclusive institutions in emerging and developing markets. It has evolved from a purely microfinance focus to a broader range of products, so agricultural finance, affordable housing, SME financing, and we are very happy about that development. And the fund's focus really is to invest in companies which offer specific products or grant access to financing for women. That is one part. The other part is that the fund manager looks closely at the institutions and their governance, on the percentage of female employees, of female board members, of females in management positions. So that is basically the decisive criterion to select portfolio companies. We as KfW are an investor to both funds. We invest on behalf of BMZ, so on behalf of the federal German government, on behalf of the EU, but also with our own funds in Women's World Banking. And the purpose really of this fund is, of course, to obtain a decent return for investors, but the very strong focus is really on enhancing access to financing for women. So if you look at the countries the fund is investing in, 40%, for example, are committed to Sub-Saharan Africa. There are very practical challenges for women to obtain financing. On the one hand, it's, for example, a woman may feel uncomfortable talking to a male loan officer, or a female loan officer may feel uncomfortable talking to a male customer because of cultural differences, difficulties, safety issues, especially if customers are in the more rural part of a country. So very, very practical and basic challenges which have to be overcome. In our view, it's a great opportunity and impact which can be achieved, given that there is such a huge financing gap, that there are more and more female entrepreneurs running SMEs, and there is just still such a huge financing gap, which is why we are very happy supporting Women's World Banking. Just a short remark on what we are doing. We are investing in that fund also as a so-called B shareholder, so we take a certain first loss piece in that fund, meaning that given that we invest in emerging countries, we understand that there is a certain risk for investors, so we take a certain risk of that as KfW. And our overarching goal really is to attract private capital to be invested in the fund, not only in this fund. We have more than 60 funds under or as invested in KfW. So our overarching goal really is to raise private capital for that purpose.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I'm definitely a big believer of blended finance solutions when it comes to financing the SDGs. So how would you, what would you say, how important it is for investors to have like DFIs like KfW alongside, investing alongside them?
I mean, I think in one of the keynotes it was mentioned that blended finance is developing rather slowly, which I think unfortunately is still true to a certain extent. I believe that main constraints for investors are probably the fact that it is quite risky to invest in emerging markets, that maybe the ticket sizes are too small, that there is the perception maybe that the investments are not substantial enough, although we believe that is not the case, that there are huge opportunities. So with us as KfW investing, we have quite a long track record of investing in emerging and developing countries. We have experience. We do quite an extensive ESG due diligence on the investments. We check the ESG policies. We obtain regular reporting from our fund managers. So I think that is something which institutional investors, which may be new to the market, could to a certain extent rely upon, that if KfW is invested in these funds, that a lot of due diligence has been put into them.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. So Raymond, over to you. So UBS launched its gender ETF in 2017, if I remember correctly. And so we could say that UBS was a little bit ahead of the curve. It was quite early in terms of launching a gender ETF. So can you please talk about your experience and where did this idea come from that you want to have like a gender ETF, and also what was the reception from investors?
Let me take a step back, David, to explain this a bit. UBS offered since many years solutions on the SI side, the investing side, but also philanthropic side, to investors to achieve their financial goals, but also their societal objectives, I would say. And in the context of this, the Wealth Management CEO office had decided in early 2016 to launch an investment theme called Gender Diversity Matters. And based on that, obviously the target was to foster the investments in this direction, to have also a key building block on the thematic side for the SI mandates. And with that, UBS Asset Management, on our side, where I work, has decided to set up a new product, the ETF, Exchange Traded Fund. It's a passive fund following certain rules that implements certain criteria on gender equality. The index based is the Equilib Gender Equality 100 Leaders Index. And for those who don't know, the Equilib is the leading data and research provider on gender equality issues. And they basically analyze global companies, roughly 3,500 across the globe, and evaluate them based on 19 different gender-related criteria. So obviously, gender balance would be one of those criteria, gender balance in leadership, in workforce, across basically the full corporate structure. But the methodology also incorporates much broader aspects when it comes to gender-related topics, maybe equal pay, parental leave, and criteria in these aspects, but also policies, whether the companies have implemented policies in gender diversity directions, or whether the company follows the United Nations empowerment of women principles. So overall, this solution selects the top 100 leader companies in these aspects, and these companies are selected in this ETF in a passive way, in a selected way based on the index. And yes, I mean, maybe one additional interesting aspect on this product is that you are not just investing in those companies which are the leaders, you have also, in addition, the management fee, which is one part of it, donated to the UBS Optimus Foundation, which is sponsoring, allocating money to the SFG 5 empowerment of women and girls goal. So this is something which is really, I would say, on different levels, not just selecting the right companies around the globe. You also take some of the proceeds out of that investments, you donate that to a good cause, and then last but not least, on a third level, you have also the ability to engage with your investments, right? So whatever has been invested in is now quite substantial. We have now reached almost the 1 billion mark, with $940 million in this ETF since the launch. It's quite a successful thematic solution. With these investments, we do stewardship. We are a responsible investor, and we start to discuss, obviously, with companies on certain topics. And it's not about the selection of the companies and these different criteria. It's more also maybe the ability to be a responsible investor and take up these criteria also in discussion, not just on the proxy voting process, also in engagement discussion, in stewardship discussion with companies to address certain topics. And since 2016, we do this also on certain subjects that are gender related. So this is basically really what's have been rising this product, the success of the product, and the main elements of this ETF on gender equality.
Yes, thank you, Michael. So I actually quite like it. That actually it's an ETF, so it's quite a mainstream instrument, and but still you guys are going beyond the screening. I mean, just a positive screening, but you do actually engagement as well, right? So that's I think very good to see.
Not just the screening, the 19 gender equality criteria. We do also a slight light green. So if you take the different shades of green, it's a light green screening where also certain value-based exclusions are applied to this product. It's basically the weapons, the alcohol, tobacco activities, where if companies engage in those activities, if you exclude those. Then obviously, as you are looking at a passive solution covering global equity universe, you try to mimic the global market. Not all the regions are same evolved in terms of gender equality implementation of the measures and the regulations. So for instance, the US and also Japan are quite laggards. So you have to keep those regions at least to the US at the 50% level, that you have somehow a global equity universe. When you only would go for the Equilib scores of the companies, you would have quite the European tilted universe. Also Australia also is also quite strong in this, but you have then obviously those countries who have stronger gender equality policies from regulatory side in place. So you have to keep US at least 50%, that you have somehow a global broad market universe that is somehow mimicking the broad market That was a bit of a challenge that we had when we, together with our wealth management CIO, the index provider Equilib, discussed how we would like to implement this methodology. And yes, the additional ESG screens were also a bit of, the more stringent you do the screens, the less diversified the investment gets. It's also a bit of a trade-off that you have there.
Okay, all right, thank you. So why clients are interested in investing into gender ETF as opposed to like just in more general ESG ETF? So what's the reason? What are you saying?
I mean, gender inequality is not only I would say, social or a moral issue. It's also, I would say, quite an economic challenge. So if you have half of the working age population, women who are not at the full potential, so the economy is not doing, could have much more potential to perform, right? So McKinsey found in a study, it's called performance of parity, that you would add 25% of global GDP over 10 years if you would address those inequality issues other way around. You would have the inequality solved, basically. So this is quite a strong, I would say, macro picture. There's also other studies out from the Patterson Institute of International Economics, where you find clear evidence that there is a strong correlation between diversity on the board of directors and across the different levels of the workforce, and the quite important profitability metrics of companies. Return on assets, return on equity, and return on invested capital. And this is really essential. This is a direct link between diversity within the company structure and shareholder return. And this is something which we observe as well with our ETF. The performance really is something over the last, it's a long-term thing, right? You have always a bit of noise around the performance evolution compared to the benchmark, the index, but we have there the gender equality ETF, and you compare this against the MSCI World, the global equity universe. And there you see also it's adding value over the long run. There's always some phases, because of the underweight of US and Japan, where some of the markets do better and less. But in the long term, you create value when you invest in better governed companies. That's simple as it is, right? It's not just like being moral and social. It's about having an economic sense behind. Yeah. So that's something which really makes, I would say, thing more appealing here. We launched this for our own wealth management, this product, but in the end, it has been sold much more broadly in the Swiss and in European market to private banks, to their clients of the private banks, of universal banks, of cantonal banks in Switzerland. They start also to have SI mandates. They need also thematic solutions. So it's been really a success story that has been driven by the thought leadership of UBS, the CIO team there, and then spread out into the world if you want so.
All right. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Michael, very much. So Andre, over to you. So my question is, I know that OBN is applying a gender lens to how it invests, and so I just want to understand first about your approach, and can you please describe it to us? And second, why do you guys do this? Like, what's the rationale behind it? I mean, OBN is already ticking many of the impact boxes, all the SDGs. I'm sure that you have like 10 SDGs already covered out of the 17. So why to add one more?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. I think just because leaving 50% of the population out from participation just doesn't make sense. It's a huge waste in talent, experience, know-how, and I think also adding a different perspective. And I think there is the business case, and you just made it. I don't need to repeat that. And I think this is really why we are doing it. And also, being an impact investor, I think it just doesn't make sense to not also look into women empowerment and gender equality. Aside from the fact that it's really a topic that is very close to my heart, from my personal background, I discovered as a child at one point in time that boys and girls are not equal, and that was a very bad moment in my life, and it really caused a little bit of a trauma. And since then, I was always kind of trying to see
how I could kind of contribute to reduce this inequality. So I think there's also a strong personal aspect here. Now, how we do it at Obiam. I think we use the 2X challenge criteria. I mean, one of our biggest clients we advise and manage is the Swiss Investment Fund for Emerging Markets, the Swiss Development Finance Institution owned by the Swiss Confederation, and is a member of the 2X Challenge. Of course, we as Obiam pushed a little bit the CFM board in the direction, and being with the CFM board also at that point in time were 2 male and 5 females, we were really finding very open doors that CFM was the early adopter of the 2X Challenge, with Switzerland not being part of the initial G7 summit establishing the 2X Challenge. So we apply these criteria, and also in our mandates, some of our mandates have SDG 5 targets, and also here we use the 2X Challenge as a framework. So we do this in 2 ways. On the one hand, we apply the 2X Challenge criteria on each and every investment we do. So basically whatever we do, we take a gender lens approach and see, even if at the first glance there is no sort of alignment with the 2X Challenge criteria, we still run the process, talk to people, and try to find out whether there is a potential angle. Because the big merit we see in doing this, of course, it's extra work at the extra cost, but at the end of the day, you also uncover things that are not obvious, and then if you have sort of a starting point where you then could engage with a company, with a fund manager, with a financial institution, really bring this gender lens into the mainstream, I think a lot can be achieved. Even if there is no specific focus on supporting female entrepreneurs. Of course, we have also investments where this is given, and I think you made a good example with the Women in World Banking Fund. I mean, we do this type of investments, but I feel it's also even more important that we make sure that gender lens is just not sort of a little niche product, but it becomes really part of investment considerations, because only then I feel we can really unlock the full value of capital. And of course, we are mainly active in developing countries where we have lots of cultural biases to overcome. And I think what we also find quite helpful is that this gender lens is not only applied in our investment activities, but I think it's also a useful and necessary exercise to start with yourself as I mean, Obiam is a relatively small company, but also kind of apply the 2X Challenge criteria on ourselves and really see how do we stand here, and do we really also fulfill basically the demands that we ask from some of our investees. And at Obiam level, I think we are quite good with the employment criteria, which for the financial sector expects 40% of staff being female. Of course, it's a huge challenge, because if in a calendar year it happens that 2 of my female colleagues leave, we might just fall under the 40%. Yeah. So then we really need to make an extra effort in hiring to replace, to stay at the 40%. Also, if you look at the Obiam Board of Directors and at the Obiam Investment Committee that takes the investment decisions, we fulfill the 2X Challenge criteria, something I'm quite proud about. So we really, and I think it's also important that if you, in a way, sometimes in the name of the Swiss government, lecture sort of your partners about how important 2X or women empowerment and gender equality is, I think you argue from a much better position if you basically can say we have our house in order, and it's also something we really make an effort to live every day in our activities. Mm-hmm. So I think this is sort of, yeah, what Obiam stands for and what we would like to achieve.
All right, thank you, Andrea. So, I mean, you mentioned some of the gender KPIs, like, like workforce diversity, and one of the most shocking statistics I've seen is that in the UK, in asset management, there are more men called David than women. And so that's something very shocking for me. But I have a question for you. So if I understood correctly, you are not applying like general KPI of how you invest, but sometimes you work with the company, so work with the investments, like with the funds that you're investing in. So what happens if they don't come along? I mean, do you divest because they're not meeting your expectations on gender? Or what's your experience? Or it's not really happening this, I mean, they just come along with you.
Yeah, I think it's still relatively new, and we are quite considerate in what we basically label as gender or women empowerment or gender equality aligned, but basically is fulfilling the 2X challenge criteria. And what is really important here is not only looking at some of the quantitative aspects, but also making sure that if your counterparty is aligned with the 2X challenge, I mean, we still have come across cases where this is just a coincidence. I find it still, it's a bit of a mystery to me how microfinance organizations have 60% or more of their clients are female, but if you then ask them about what sort of specifics they have in the product development to serve their female client base even better, and you're just basically meeting a blank face, then I mean you can basically assume it's more like a coincidence that it's 60% female clients and there is no intentionality. I mean, this is now really sort of an extreme example, but we have seen these examples. So it's not only about fulfilling a quota or a criteria, it's also about intentionality. So if such an MFI were to say, okay, we have 60% female clients, and this is what we do in order to serve them better, and probably bringing then the 60% to 70%, this is then, of course, we feel it's strongly 2X challenge aligned. So I think this element of intentionality also helps then to avoid cases where there is just sort of a lip service to it. Mm-hmm. But of course, still, we are of course measuring basically the performance on these criteria, and then it's still a part of the discussion, what do we do? Because if you do private equity investments, these are highly illiquid, and divesting is often simply not a reason. So it's then really all about engagement, and you mentioned that on the listed side, and I think that's also very important on our side to really kind of just nudge your probably sometimes reluctant sponsors and try to convince them, probably also link them with another financial institution or another fund manager who has already done steps in the direction of gender equality. And I think peer-to-peer learning has to be proven quite a powerful tool here as well.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Andrea, very much. So Marlene, I understand that Alpha Mundi conducts gender analysis when building the project pipeline and also when you do the due diligence. So can you please first describe the approach of what you guys are doing, and also maybe talk about where they decided they come from, why you are interested in gender?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So Alpha Mundi is an impact fund manager, and we have investments both in Latin America and in Africa. And from the very start, in order for a company to meet our criteria, they need to have some kind of positive impact, either socially or for the environment, or preferably both. And so the way that we've incorporated gender lens investing in our due diligence process, so in the screening of pipeline companies, is with a diagnostic tool that asks and discusses with the company how gender is incorporated throughout their business plan. So we start with design of their product. We move on to the manufacturing and the sales process. The manufacturing process, then the sales process. We then look at marketing, And finally, we look at the policies and procedures internally within the company itself. And so once we've surveyed the company, so it's really just a type of due diligence on these areas, on how they stack up in terms of, do they include women? Do they think actively about women when designing the process? Or the needs of the sales staff in reaching their customers? How best to get their message out to the women who use their products and services. Then we've got a very good basis, first of all, to analyze the company, but also, as Andrea mentioned, to engage with them, right? So once we know where the company stands, and where say the pros and the cons are, or maybe their strengths and areas of improvement, we follow or we incorporate this in our due diligence process, take it to the investment committee, decide on the merits of the investment, both socially and financially. That's important. We are commercial-based investors. We can then, once the company is included in our portfolio, work with them and engage with them on ways that we can help them. Our foundation, the Alpha Mundi Foundation, provides technical assistance with or along the lines of gender lens investing. In fact, to engage with them in the areas where they can improve across these 5 metrics. So that's a little bit about our approach. Your second question was?
Why? Why are you doing this? Maybe we have 5 minutes left. Before the questions, or because we started like 10 minutes late. So,
So I think there are reams of information on why having a more diverse team, from governance and leadership all the way through to diversity in staff and incorporating women, frankly, throughout the value chain, brings financial returns as well as social returns. And so that's our premise, I think, when you talk about why this approach to gender lens investing. I think our idea is we want to be very inclusive. And so the companies that we work with tend, not always, to be very receptive to incorporating women and considering women's needs throughout their process, but don't necessarily know how, and don't necessarily know where to start. And so it's with the type of resources that we're able to mobilize that we can help a CEO who says, gee, I never thought about that. A little bit about what you said, right? So if 60% of your clients are women, and you don't think about how to integrate that vital fact into how you deliver your product, you're missing out potentially on ways to increase your revenue, improve your margins. And so by incorporating a bit broader definition when we look at gender lens investing, we help those who are open and willing but never thought about how to maximize and optimize that potential to actually get there. And so we're trying to move the needle as much as we can with the widest segment of the population that we can.
All right, thank you, Marlene. Great, thank you very much. So we have, maybe we can take 2 questions. One question, so one question from the audience, please.
Surely there's someone out there who wants to know. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you can maybe shout, and I can repeat the question in the mic. Yes, maybe I can just repeat the question so the people who are on live stream as well. So basically the question is, what about men? I mean, do we have gender indicators for men? It's also a very important part of the discussion on gender.
I can give a very brief answer and then pass it along because I know we're short on time. So the fifth indicator that I talked about were policies and procedures. And I think that that's important to include everyone. So if there's a sexual harassment policy, many of the companies that we have that are small enough may not have thought of implementing one. And so I think that making sure that these policies and procedures are fair for everyone. One of the things that we do with our technical assistants is we do employee surveys. And so are your needs being met as an employee? We don't just survey women. And so one of the questions we ask is, how gender inclusive is your institution? And it's interesting to see the results then between men and women. But do the work hours allow you to pick up your child after school? Does the work environment allow you to perhaps change in a dressing room that's separate and adequate and allows you to feel safe? These are questions that aren't just relevant for women, they're relevant for anyone, no matter how they identify along gender. And so I think that we then look at a net promoter, an NPS, right? A net promoter score. How happy are you? Would you recommend the products and services to others? And an employee satisfaction survey. How happy are you in your job? And we track that. And so I think that the first thing we do is figure out how we can make employees happier. That again improves retention, improves engagement and work performance, and hopefully you see the impact on the bottom line as a result.
Maybe Raymond, maybe we have time for your reaction, and then we are done. We close.
Last comment on the passive solution. I mean, this is much broader than just the name of this ETF. Would make public. Obviously, gender equality is about gender, but it goes broader, as mentioned before, with the methodology. It goes into various different criteria, and in the end, it's really that you select companies which are better governed. And this is broad. This is also including whistleblowing policies that would not just like take up gender issues. They have also much broader scope. You have their flexible work options, equal pay. It goes into DEI topic basically, but obviously, yes, gender is the overarching theme there. But so it's surely something which I would say selects those companies and addresses those issues for the environmental, social, governance theme in the S and G space. Yeah, maybe you leave out with the climate topic, but you go really broad in the S and the G of ESG investing, including also diversity in a broader scope. This was a short one.
All right, thank you, Raymond. So we close for the sake of time. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for Sustainable Finance Geneva for the invitation, and for GLIS as well. Tim, I think over to you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panelists for this. We're going to now move to the closing statement of the morning session, as well as a number of announcements. So for those of you who have announcements to make, if you could come next to me and stand by my side to have the podium for 30 to 60 seconds and announce on behalf of your organization what you're going to do related to Gender Lens in 2022. And after that, we will share with you the outlook for the GLIS in 2022. So my first announcer is Anna Mori from the ITC. Anna, please.
Good morning, almost good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, thank you, Alpha Mundi Sustainable Finance Geneva, for bringing us here. I'm here to announce that tomorrow at 12:30 at the Forum Geneva Auditorium right across the street, we're launching the publication titled 12 Lessons in Gender Lens Investing during a dynamic discussion. Ambassador of Colombia, heads of impact funds in Africa and from Europe, also with the Deputy Executive Director of the International and the director of the United Nations SDG Lab. In a nutshell, in contrast with other publications that we have about the topic that actually focus on how to apply gender lens investing to an investment portfolio, this publication is a bit different because we know that there are many experts that already co-written other publications about this specific topic. What we are doing, we are sharing 12 lessons learned from our network of investors working in the field for many, many years. So basically the do's and the don'ts in gender lens investing. I work for the International Trade Center. We are a joint agency of the World Trade Organization and of the United Nations. We have an initiative called She Trades, connecting 3 million women to markets by the end of this year. So we interviewed basically in depth on a global survey, more than 2,000 women-led businesses from more than 85 countries, really asking them what are their struggles. So this publication talks about the needs of the women as well. I would love to hear also during the panel's experience from women entrepreneurs-led businesses from the ground. So I will not speak, Tim, about the 12 lessons. I hope you join us tomorrow, register for the event online at the Building Bridges Week website, and I'll send you later a link to the publication itself. All right, thank you so much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Anna. Our next announcer is Jessica Espinoza from 2X. Jessica.
I'm representing 2X here today, and I'm excited to share that we are starting the operations of our 2X Collaborative on 1st of January. The 2X Collaborative is a global industry body for gender lens investing that's convening the entire spectrum of investors. We have, since we had a pre-announcement at the UN Generation Equality Forum earlier this year, we've already onboarded over 30 members who are development finance institutions, big commercial banks, including Citigroup, as well as pension funds, private equity funds, and other types of investors. So we invite all of you to join us. We're really excited about this work and particularly thrilled to have as core partners Gender Smart, from whom you've already heard a lot today, as well as ILN, the Investor Leadership Network that's convening pension funds with over $5 trillion assets under management. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. A couple of announcements now on behalf of GLIS. First, I'm very happy to share with you our first annual Gender Lens Investing Report. This report is now available online on the Sustainable Finance Geneva website, as well as on the GLIS LinkedIn page. Essentially, it's a summary of all the standards, best practices, and innovation happening in gender lens. And it's just to make sure that everybody in Switzerland and in the financial industry is on the same page. We hope to launch next year an ambassadors program. So we invite members of Swiss financial institutions who are interested in becoming an advocate for gender lens investing to contact us. And we will then organize training sessions for their leadership in hope of changing mindsets and then policies and then product offerings. The other thing that we're looking for next year is the first anniversary of the Gender Lens Initiative, which was launched on the 8th of March. Unfortunately, tonight, the cocktail had to be canceled due to COVID-19 constraints. So this is only postponed to the week of the 8th of March. We'll be happy to see all of you and many more, I hope, in better circumstances. One more announcement, perhaps, on the GLIS is that we'll be looking for at least one, if not two, vice chairs. As you know, I'm the chair of the GLIS for this year and the next, but I think it's a good thing to plan succession ahead of time. And I would love to be supported by either men or women who are interested in the theme, who have 10 to 20 years of experience in the financial industry, and who are willing to come on pro bono to help us steer the agenda of this very fast-growing and very dynamic field and initiative. I'll finish by walking the talk. I said that no conference should end up without any concrete commitments. I'm happy to commit on behalf of Alpha Mooney Group a 3-year donation to Sustainable Finance Geneva. Next year we'll donate 10,000 francs, in 2023 15, and in 2024 20,000 francs to support the GLIS in its growth. I hope that other sponsors will join us in financing this industry transformation in Switzerland. Thank you so much to all the speakers who made the effort of traveling here today despite challenging circumstances, to all of you in the room and those of you who followed us in the live stream, and enjoy the rest of your Building Bridges week. Thank you.